What's fascinating about Trump is that, like, he probably doesn't give a shit about workers. But, like, I heard this in a Steve Bannon interview, actually, but, like, apparently Trump, he always asks whatever somebody is thinking. He'll ask the random gardener, he'll ask, like, the person delivering food, he'll ask, like, random workers, always like, "What are you thinking about the state of the world?" Like, and be honest with me, you know? This is kind of like the weird rational genius of, like, business people, business tycoons, is business tycoons have to know what people are thinking because they're selling shit to people. So
Right.
they have, like, a weird kind of reptilian intelligence of, like, understanding people in a way that a lot of, like, out of touch intellectuals often won't,
Well,
right?
this makes the Trump alliance with the tech oligarchs somewhat interesting because the
Mhm.
tech oligarchs come from a sector where that's not true.
Right, yes, yeah.
They're rentiers, effectively. It's an interesting thing to look at, but yes, a bureaucrat also very much doesn't have to know what people want.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/one dime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today, I'm here with C. Derick Varn, friend of the show. We've talked multiple times now. I always enjoy whenever we have a conversation and like to get your perspective on things. And there's been a lot happening, too much happening, and so much happening that maybe we've forgotten whether we're still at the end of history, whether we're still in Fukuyama's world of the end of history. But so much has been happening, right? With, Gaza, Trump announcing the US is gonna essentially help clear out Gaza for Israel. And now, most recently announced that Palestinians have no right to return. How this is gonna happen, I have no fucking clue because so many countries seemingly don't agree to the proposal, think it's insane. But of course, Trump's tariffs have been very impactful on Canada. Not so much at
Mhm.
the level of the economy yet, but it's unified us more than ever, which is really weird. I've never seen, and it's actually made the liberals more popular. By the way, liberals have gotten way more popular out of nowhere. It's really bizarre. But yeah, there's just been a lot happening. I guess the first thing, Varn, is I don't think you have to introduce yourself to the people who've already heard this. But what is maybe I do want you to introduce about yourself.
Mhm.
Is your sort of like your right to left turn? Because I want to go into more depth about that this time, which is the fact that you were somebody who was actually like on the right, a paleo conservative, and you moved to the left. And it seems like we only see the opposite of that now, as we talked about last time. It's
Yeah.
like in an age where everyone in every country seems to be moving to the right. I mean, it's like kind of might be interesting to hear your perspective.
So I became a right winger kind of formally between 1999 and 2001. And that is not in the way that many people of my generation became more right wing, which was they were radicalized by 9/11 and got on to the Bush administration. For me, I was an anti globalization protester in high school and a working class one because I had seen my community decimated by deindustrialization. I lived in central Georgia, which is not often thought of as an industrial area, but we were a paper mill producer and we made zippers and we did a lot of these auxiliary kinds of production. particularly until the mid 1980s. And then we kind of got narrowed down in central Georgia to one industry, which was packaging tobacco. And when there was a reconsolidation after the tobacco lawsuits and laws passed in the mid 90s, Brown and Williamson packed up shop, and the only major employers in in my area became hospitals, churches, public schools, and Geico. So, the insurance company, which is a major deindustrialization. It's a very similar pattern that you see in like the Midwest of the United States, and particularly the upper Midwest. And so being concerned about that as young as 15 or 16, because I saw people who, lost everything in the mid 90s during the Clinton administration when things were supposed to be really good for the United States. I mean, this is, so my local region became more and more dependent on military Keynesianism, the poverty draft, et cetera, things that don't really exist anymore. I mean, another thing that happened post 9/11 is the poverty draft becomes less and less relevant. It doesn't really exist today, actually. One of the things that killed it is drones, but the other thing is private contractors. So there's just a lot less need for as many warm bodies coming out of the Southeast. And I was also anti-war because I've come from a family that has been subject to military Keynesianism. And so there's a lot of former soldiers in my extended family who came back all broken up, fucked up, and not with a lot of financial gains to show for it. I don't so much talk about that a ton. And between that and then getting into college, I spent a little bit of time homeless by accident. And when I was 19 years old, my response to a lot of leftists in college, now I will admit that this is a very different left than what we have today, but they were mostly like gutter punk anarchists, lifestylists, and Democrats, and like anti-war Democrats who would still somehow justify having relations to, having us vote for people who wanted to won the war, but like slightly differently. And by the war, I mean, which one are we talking about? But what I remember from this time period is being very disgusted with the neoconservative wing of the GOP and with the Democrats, because a lot of the stuff that I saw accelerated under Bush had really began in earnest in my memory under Bill Clinton, such as the bombing of the Sudanese medical factory and those random bombings at the end of his tenure after the Monica Lewinsky affair. So I got attracted and pulled into that world. I participated. My first trip to the West Coast of the United States was to the Battle of Seattle. We literally hitchhiked to part of it. And I got exposed to Pat Buchanan directly there. I heard him speak weirdly. And I also kind of developed an aversion to college activists and anarchists who and I didn't have the vocabulary to articulate this. I was only like 18 years old, but I saw them cultural capital mongering, being way more concerned about what people said and how people said it than what they did and what they actually did. Like if you read like Musa Al-Gharabi's We Have Never Been Woke, like a lot of what he described hit me like a brick in the late 90s too. Right after 9/11, I went to the anti-war protests that were beginning to form up, particularly in response to the G8 summit, which was happening in Sea Island, which was, where we live in Georgia. So I was expecting people to show up. An international answer, which is kind of, the PSL/WWP. I forget who was in charge of it this early. It's the PSL now, but the International Answer Coalition was involved, and they were like talking about critical support for the Iranian government, but not just any part of the Iranian government, but like the more radical clerical end. And I was like, why would I want to support that? Like what does a Shia theocracy mean to me? I don't want to overthrow it. I have no interest in fucking in Iranian politics whatsoever, but I don't know why you'd want me to support it. And I kind of got scooped up in a bunch of people around Justin Raimondo, which is the guy who runs antiwar.com. And and I read The American Conservative, and they were more consistently anti-war than the Democratic parts of it. I also was trying to figure out economics at the time, and I've never been a big fan of Keynesianism. So I went through the and I didn't standard Chicago school neoliberalism also didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I started going through alternate interpretations of that. But the Austrian economists seemed frankly delusional
Hmm.
to me.
Friedrich Hayek, von Mises,
Von Mises even more than Friedrich Hayek, yeah. And
libertarians.
hardcore libertarians.
And,
So
wait, maybe for the audience, it's worth tying in what a paleo-conservative is, because that's kind of a libertarian that's culturally conservative. This is kind of how I understand it.
well,
Not just that they're on
okay,
the paleo diet, right?
yeah, so a paleo-libertarian, there's two schools of thought, really. There's excuse me, I said paleo-libertarian, but that's a school of the paleo-conservatives. So there's the old libertarians who are often culturally conservative, but in theory believe that people have the right to do whatever. So they're not going to politically try to pass laws that stop gay marriage, but they oppose the idea privately. They have strange bedfellows, but we can get into that later. And then there's the even more rare traditional paleo conservatives who frankly are closer to what people pretend Trump is. So when you hear this idea of like economic populism, strong borders,
Like Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon.
yeah, Steve Bannon, especially Steve Bannon, was closer to that school. And then from that school, there are people who are to the right of that who were just outright white nationalists. And I didn't really know that much about them until I got a lot deeper, and they became more prominent. But when I was first involved, it was mostly as kind of a conservative anti-war movement as an alternative to the liberal and left one in the United States. And also, I wanted to undo NAFTA. It was kind of as simple as that. It was sort of like a workerist politics.
That sounds like Steve Bannon stuff, because I was listening to his interviews recently, and I've been following for a while, ever since I, was writing about the so-called alt-right pipelines back in the day.
Mhm.
Although I have a different view on that now, a little bit. I view that more as like a effect rather than a cause. But the I think a lot of leftists would be surprised to listen to Steve Bannon. Like, listen to him, not believing everything he says, because 50% of what he says is full of shit. But like, you'll understand the appeal, because some people on the left think like, to be ever on the right, you must have been some kind of fascist or a neo-Nazi. And it's like, you hear Bannon talk, he talks about like wanting every American to have an equal shot. He talks about how he wants to prioritize all Americans, even like black ones, as long as they're citizens. And he literally, I was shocked recently. He's even more explicitly like, I wouldn't say, definitely not anti-capitalist. He claims to be capitalist, but he'll say like, capitalists want to suppress wages, and that's why we should close the border. And it's like, you're almost you're like kind of partially there, but of course, then he'll thinks there's nothing at all wrong with like billionaires. But it's,
Right.
yeah. So were you closer
Well,
to that school, or like, because I've heard of other,
very much closer to that school. Although because of the anti-war allegiance, I ended up hanging out with libertarians all the time. So also that school in the aughts was very much, how did my friend describe it? I have a right-wing friend who used to describe it. It was the ill-fitting Brooks Brothers suits of conservatism, meaning that like there were key figures associated with way before Bannon, Joe Sobran, Pat Buchanan. But if you looked at the wars in the Republican Party going all the way back to Reagan fusionism, they'd been the losing side of the fusion every time.
Mhm.
One, they weren't particularly evangelical. What you'll see in a lot of paleo conservatives is they tended to be Orthodox Christian, Catholic, or Jewish. The Jewish part of that is interesting. Because there's a ton of Jewish neoconservatives too, but like Paul Gottfried was Jewish. And I started reading Paul Gottfried when I was 19 years old. Yeah, I think I read After Liberalism, The Strange Non-Death of Liberalism book when I was 19.
Strange Death. I
And
didn't even know he had a book on Strange Death of Liberalism. The one that I've been reading is The Strange Death of Marxism. Now
oh
it's
yeah, excuse me. Yeah,
we could talk about that after because it's weird how shrewd at points he is. Like at sometimes he's actually kind of on the nose. Like he understands what's happened to the left a little bit better than like the likes of Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay do, who like think
well,
is
when
a
you're Marcuse's student, you would think you would.
yeah,
To
which
be
is all
fair.
opposite. He talks positively about Marcuse. He thinks he disagrees with him, but he's like, "Oh, I liked him. He was actually a quite culturally conservative guy." And I've been trying to point out actually even when I've talked about Marcuse that I don't think culturally conservative is really accurate at all, but like Marcuse has a shift in his thinking where he does become a little bit more like skeptical of a lot of like 60s new leftism already by
Mhm.
one-dimensional man, but more explicitly by counter-revolution and revolt. And all the people who read Eros and Civilization, which is his like new left book, they kind of totally don't see that. So when Paul Gottfried said that, I'm like, yeah, he gets it. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't want to get off track there. Paul Gottfried, so he's a paleo-conservative thinker.
he is.
Is
Yes.
he the kind of paleo-conservative you were into?
He was much closer, yeah.
Okay.
So the people I read at that time was Pat Buchanan, Joe Sobran. We read a lot of Leo Strauss, but we read it critically and hostilely. I read a lot of Lou Rockwell, who was a paleo libertarian and part of Thomas Woods, who's like a Catholic, almost a neo-Confederate, frankly, but I didn't know that at the time. Now, I didn't stay on that side a super long time, although, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is like, I started reading my first exposure to Christopher Lasch was on the back of a Rage Against the Machine album. His book is actually on a Rage Against the Machine's second album is on the back of like this leftist book, and there's Culture of Narcissism, I think, right by an Angela Davis book. It's very strange. So I had been exposed to him from that, but we really read him a lot from a conservative lens in the aughts. And the other thing that was driving my conservatism at the time was that post-structuralism was the dominant paradigm in the humanities when I was going through it. And so it was Derrida and Foucault and Deleuze and Baudrillard. And I kind of like Baudrillard. I still kind of like Baudrillard, but like, so we weren't coming up against Marxist. We were coming up against that. And then in the left, you have to put yourself back in the 90s to remind yourself of this. But the left-wing ideas at the time were like Derek Jensen's primitivism and Murray Bookchin's municipal anarchism or municipalism and annoying Trotskyists. That's what was available if you weren't going to be just some kind of issue-driven rad lib Democrat. And so Bookchin and the post-leftist confuse me. And by post-leftist, I meant the
Anarchists.
anarchist. Yeah, not the current post-leftist, the old ones. Bob Black and such. But I kind of got, a little bit into Bob Black and them too. But the thing is, I read them as kind of having conservative arguments. I mean, you're arguing that civilization and technology is deleterious to the human subject. That's a very conservative argument. So that's where I was. I was an odd fit for a variety of reasons. One, I wasn't Christian, and I've never really been super Christian ever, but are Christian at all ever. And two, this form of the right was viewed hostilely by both the left and the right. And when we had allies, it actually tended to be more left wing back then. So there were these things like the libertarians, which were libertarians who believed that racism and sexism are real. And like we would sometimes do work with them. Sign the Euston Manifesto, but in the anti-war wing, and in people who don't know what that is, I can tell you. But yeah, I signed that, and I saw myself as like a moderate, let's say even nationalist, who I did see myself as an anti-racist, but I was also I did have some culturally chauvinistic points of view. If you're a signatory of the Houston Manifesto, you almost have to be. So it was a strange time because I was an anti-war advocate, but I also was like not a super big fan of like Americans, for example, promoting our denouncing like Baathism. Because I'd be like, that's not our fucking problem. Like that's for Syrians and Iraqis and maybe Iranians. It's not, why should I give a shit? So, that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, no, I think that's enough people. Like that's a lot you gave us there. And I'm trying to think of like the best way to go in that direction. But I guess the more obvious conclusion there is like, why did you leave the right? Because it's like, I think what you hinted at, why you moved to the right, is something that seems to be a reoccurring thing is that I think like a lot of what the right is and what a lot of the left is, they're relational concepts. They're kind of often defined in opposition to each other. We don't like to admit it. We want to act like it's all beliefs, all principles. And of course, that's part of it. But a lot of it is like you just don't like the other side. You like the other side even less. And I noticed
Well,
a lot of people who are right wingers, there's this image a lot of people have in their heads of like what a right winger is. And it's always like, if I'm not like super gung ho on anti-racism or whatever, I must be like super like a Confederate or something, you know? Or it could just be like they just find the left very cringy and think the left is going to be worse if they took power, right? Like I think that's often the position of like more moderate conservatives or maybe even some like hardliner conservatives, usually not like not like white supremacists necessarily, but like it is something I see just talking to conservatives in my life. Like it's a lot of the time just they perceive the left as kind of dominant. And in some sense, if you take left to mean like in a very specific way culturally, I guess, you could say maybe that was true kind of for a period. And in academia, I mean, it is true. We
yeah,
have to
it
admit,
is.
like, academia is not Marxist. I always like to tell people this when people say academia has a leftist bias. Well, okay, if we're going to talk about the social sciences, exclude STEM, it definitely has a leftist bias. I wouldn't say
Absolutely.
I wouldn't say it's like a Marxist bias, but it's definitely like everyone knows it's a leftist bias. Like, come on, like
It's yeah, it's a center left bias. I mean, it also has a bias against radical leftists to some degree, but like,
depends what do you mean, right? Because like there's
right.
and do we mean radical leftists? Like, do we mean Marxist or do we mean Angela Davis? Which I know is complicated, but
Well, I mean, Angela Davis is interesting. I mean, you go from being a vice presidential candidate for the CPUSA, and the few times the CPUSA even ran any candidate for major office, to, I don't know, she at one time appeared in an event that was supporting charter schools. So, I mean, Angela Davis has her own thing.
didn't endorse Bernie. I was shocked when I found that out. I didn't even realize that at the time. It's like two completely different people. Angela Davis back in the day. Angela Davis.
Right.
But it is the story of a lot of leftists. Like leftists become Democrats in America. And a lot of ones become Republicans too. Like there's all those Black Panthers who became Republicans. I think you might remember which ones. I kind of forget exactly.
I think Cleaver did. And yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember who else just became kind of a grifter. So, I mean, there's a reason why the ones that people name everything after is Newton and Hampton, because, well, yeah, they're the more radical ones.
And they died.
And also, they didn't live long enough for us to see them go in a different direction. So for me, I wanted to like the left. I mean, this is one of the things that makes my trajectory a little bit complicated. I never been a fan of the Democrats because I grew up in the Southeast. And you think of the Southeast as a solidly Republican area, but that didn't happen until the year 2000. So for me, I was always like, how the fuck are these like neo-Confederates in a party with the civil rights movement people. And that only ended completely, at least at the state level, in 2000. Now I was already an adult by that point. So, like, I just remember being sort of taken aback and being like, well, these people clearly don't believe in anything. I might not like what the Republicans believe in, but the different camps do believe things. I didn't like evangelicals, was not a big fan of the moral majority. I was agnostic on the legality of abortion. I did not like neo-Confederates, and I knew a bunch because I'm from Georgia. But I also thought that despite all the talk of helping the poor that I saw on the left, that the left was by and large the upper middle class. And that they were full of contradictions. And that was really obvious to me when I was in college. Because, for
I was
example,
about to ask that. Is that when you realized? Because like that's when I realized. Because like
yeah,
my bachelor's was like bachelor's degree was
mhm,
more centrist technocrat types,
mhm,
whereas like grad school was a bunch of people who are like Marxist, communist adjacent. And I was like, yeah, 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 I'm gonna be with people who I finally agree with ideologically. And I saw so many contradictions. Like, you got communists with like wearing like Gucci,
yeah,
talking about organizing workers.
yeah. I mean, so for me, I'll put it in I'll put it in a way that makes it like, I'll just give an example. I was talking to the head of the education department, and that's when we were beginning to do anti-racist stuff. And in theory, I didn't even have a problem with that. I would roll my eyes at certain kinds of anti-racist stuff, but even then I'd be like, well, why, if we really want to like help the Black community, I would say at the time, why are we focusing on high-level universities through affirmative action? Because almost like very few people in any group get access to those. Why aren't we focusing on improving elementary school? But so I would say that, and then my education professors would argue with me and talk about the need for diversity. But then they would go and recruit in North Atlanta for students at this, college that started off as a women's college and then became a liberal arts university that was public, that like working class people could afford. That's it, was its stated mission. And they would go, and instead of it serving the community it was in, they would go and recruit not out of state initially, but from the richest neighborhoods in my state. And I knew that. And I was like, so the people who are telling me that we should care about poor Black people aren't going to find good recruits of poor Black students. They're going to the whitest, our richest immigrant neighborhoods in my state and recruiting from there. And yeah, they get people of color, but they're not people of color from my community. They're people of color who are from other countries. And that was a trend I started noticing even in undergrad. And my training was also interesting because I was in a philosophy department by my junior year, but my philosophy department was half super liberal Nietzscheans and half conservative Hegelians. And they had both taught analytic philosophy, so it wasn't even continental philosophy. And then I was in the literature department. And one of the interesting things about the literature department that people often don't know is that English teachers tend to be the most conservative high school teachers, but believe it or not, in the United States anyway. But the English department is where radical ideas go like an elephant's graveyard, which I still feel that way. So it's like, I was reading Marx, but I was reading Marx through like Jameson and being like, okay, so why do I care if I'm doing class analysis of literary characters?
So true though. That is like a trope. Like there's a whole Instagram like comedian who does parodies of stuff like that, and it's like people who'll do like a Marxist analysis of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
It's like bread
Yeah.
tube, but except it's like your academic career.
Right. And BreadTube didn't exist yet. I mean, we have to
And all the bread
remind us.
people study literature and like theater, so it's just kind of hilarious.
Right. Right. And I remember being, you know, constantly getting into trouble for an undergrad for stuff I just didn't know. Like, I would say a phrase, and I'm going to use it with the demarcation that I know this is a slur now, but I would say, I got gypped off. I did not know, I literally did not know that that was referring to Romani because there were no Romani near me. Why would we say that? It was just something that was said. So, and I was screamed at one time by, this Ohio liberal student. And the other thing that got me was that, and this is less talked about, but this is actually from a racial point of view, is that the liberal anti-racist that I know did not go in the black neighborhoods. A lot of them were from the north, were from the upper mid-Atlantic that I met in college. They were recruited from like Ohio and Pennsylvania. And my future wife was from Pennsylvania. I'd spent time there, the future ex-wife, really. But those were the whitest communities that I'd ever been in. And I was like, what? Like, you're talking about segregation here, but we're not segregated. I could go into a black bar, but you're like, well, where I live, there are no black bars. And I'm like, yeah, because you also don't have enough black people. Whereas here, they're 50% of the population as opposed to like 5. And I would just hear wild stuff about how racist we were in the Southeast. And yet also from people who would not venture, even though they were supposedly anti-racist, really did not interact with black people at all. And so these things really confounded me. Now, how did I get out of that? I mean, you kind of implied that. That's a more complicated story. And you're right that it's partially social and partially situational. So one of the things for me is I was in the Paul Gottfried and all this other stuff, but I had not really gotten deep enough to deal with some of the weirder, sketchier characters on this end of the right. So one of the things that happened to me was, even though I was not a paleo-libertarian, I read Lou Rockwell a lot, and I knew they published Neo-Confederates and Stephen Molyneux back in the day when he was doing Free Domain Radio and basically starting a cargo cult, but was an ANCAP, not a nationalist back then. And those people freaked me out. But they were publishing Gary North, and they wrote an apology for Rushdoony, who was a true dominionist. And I was like, what are these libertarians doing in alignment with someone who literally wants us to stone gay people and have a theocracy? Like, that's insane. So I that started to freak me out. Then I think it's around 2000, when I was in grad school, I started exchanging letters with different people online, including a certain Richard Spencer. And the reason why I was exchanging letters with Richard Spencer, he had gotten involved with a Georgia think tank called the American Policy Institute, which I didn't know what that was. That has a very normal sounding name. It's a white nationalist policy institute. However, you wouldn't know it just from hearing its name.
Should do that. Marxists should be like, they should have names like that. I've been saying. Just call it the Institute for Human Innovation. Instead, no, they call it like
Jacobin.
The Communist Party of the United States. MAGA communism. Abolish the family. Let's scare everyone away.
Yeah. Well,
become a cult.
So I was exchanging some emails with Spencer because I was interested in his thesis topic that he did when he was under the academic tutelage of Paul Gottfried, which was he studied Adorno. And I was getting into the Frankfurt School from the right. I'd heard, like, I started hearing the cultural Marxist accusations and also the everyone's a secret Trotskyist accusations. Those were actually started on the right first. And they didn't feel true to me, but I was like, okay, I'll try to figure this out. So I had like 2 or 3 email exchanges with Richard Spencer about race and Adorno, and then realized it dawned on me he was a white nationalist. And then I read a lot of Joe Sobran. I mentioned him. Joe Sobran was a big fan of Pat Buchanan. He wrote for the National Review, but was kicked out. And I didn't know why he was kicked out. I got told that he was too radical, like Sam Francis, but he didn't seem like a white nationalist. But then I think it was 2005, and I hit this rant where he blamed all the Jews for Bolshevism. And I was like, what? Like, I was like, wait, what? What did half my family do? They weren't Bolsheviks. Like, fuck it. They seem anti-communist, really. And that did 2 things. It got me interested in socialism at first, just as not like wanting to convert. I just wanted to understand it. And it made me realize that I was potentially really not welcome on this side because I had intermarried families. I myself am half Jewish ethnically and grew up, I have a Hebrew school, some Hebrew school education. And I was like, oh shit. Like, okay. And so I started realizing that it wasn't just weird neo-Confederates. And I always thought neo-Confederates were weird, but I grew up in the South. There were plaques that said War of Northern Aggression where I grew up. So it was just like somewhat normal for me to think like, okay, well, yeah, of course we have neo-Confederates. We lost the war. People were pissed off about that still 150 years later. But, this this was a realization that I didn't really understand it. And then I started reading Hans Hermann Hoppe. It's another Frankfurt School influenced right winger. And he was basically like, he was techno neo feudalism before it was cool, but he thought it was a good thing. He was like,
He's,
capitalism is feudalism. Like,
Curtis Yarvin's kind of influence. He's he wrote the book The Democracy, the God That Failed.
right. Which I own on Kindle from this time period. Like I still have it. So I read a lot of that, and I started learning more and more about the European New Right, Greca and places like that. And I started getting a little scared. And the other thing that I had a problem with is I didn't really trust state education, and I still am skeptical of elements of state education, even though I'm a public school teacher. But I started working in public schools, and there were just certain things the right said that I couldn't justify for what I was seeing in public schools. Cause I'm like, oh, these schools aren't that bad. And the private schools aren't going to take these students. And yeah, it's not meritocratic. And it's not just the influx of foreigners that are making it so not meritocratic. So, and the other thing was when I really started trying to figure out what the economics of the non-libertarian and the paleo-conservatives were, I'm like, so is capitalism good or bad, though? You seem to want to have it both ways. And it started pushing me out. So some of it was ideological, but some of it was like I felt like I was adjacent to people who would like, oh, these people hate me. So it was, I went through my first step out of that situation was the Houston Manifesto, which I mentioned, which was me reacting to both the kind of people who was like, oh, those weird Nazis and the left. Cause I was like, why, like, of course they don't want us to go and bomb Iran, but I also don't know why I should support the government. Why should I feel one way or another about Iranian politics? That's Iranians' business. And if they want to have a revolt, fine. Like, that's not my business. And I realized that the kind of like isolationism that I thought I believed in, it didn't really exist. So
I hate to make this comparison because people always like to shit on like people who compare like the far left and the far right. I'm not trying to make them seem like morally, equivalent in any way. But I do noticed like that is one way you can get repelled by an ideology is by just getting exposed to the more fringe extreme aspects of it. And like was it so like I had a kind of Marxist reaction as a result of being schooled in purely like liberal technocracy. And even by
Mhm.
then I was like more of like a social democrat, but like didn't I kind of got into Marxism as a reaction to like stuff I was being taught. Then much after, kind of maybe even during like early COVID, still by this point,
Mhm.
I had a bit of like a tanky phase. Like people don't know about this, it's hard to imagine because it was before I made videos. But like, well, it's
Mm.
not that hard to imagine, but some people who are like tankies will be like, no, he's a liberal. I get called, they all call me liberal. But I had a tanky phase. And what really, for me though, that like a lot of people who become quote unquote tankies, it's just anti-imperialism and kind of some
Mhm.
sympathies for, like, actually existing socialism. They're not, like, wanting to throw everyone in gulags and fucking, you know, they think like, of course, there's a nuanced perspective on Stalin. He didn't kill that many people, but he's also, he's not he did many bad things. As I started seeing that side of the left, like, seeing a lot of the neo-Stalinists crop up who would be setting, Grover Fur to say, well, actually, they would like very much defend all like the Moscow trials, all that stuff, and they would also kind of imply, which is more common than like this is like I see this a lot actually, is a sort of sentiment that the problem wasn't that they killed too many people, it's that they didn't kill enough, and they don't say it that way, but they'll imply it by like saying, oh well, you know, Khrushchev was hiding there, and the revisionists came after. Or like Gorbachev, his dad was a kulak,
Right.
you know? I mean, there's, like, people in Russia who believe that. It seems like they're old people. There's, like, these kind of viral street interviews they have of Stalin. Anyway, but it's more or less like that kind of totalitarian aspect. It's more, I think, like what you mentioned earlier, the cringe aspects of the left that I still find annoying. I still find that annoying. Like, the
Yeah.
kind of they'll talk about representing minorities, but then they'll say stuff like abolishing the family. Which, like, I know there's a nuanced position on. I'm aware there's a nuanced position on, but, like, anyone with any brain would know that that's, like, rhetorically crazy. And also, it's not
Right.
necessar it's also even if it is, like, there is a good critique of the nuclear family for sure, but it's like, do we like, to act like we have a solution that is, like, readily available is just delusional and ignores all the weird collectivization experiments that actually happened under, like, the early Soviet Union, under early Mao before they were abandoned very quickly.
I was about to say they were abandoned very quickly in the Soviet Union, in Israel, and the Kibbutzim, and also when you read what was originally meant by family abolition from socialists in the 19th century, we kind of already have it. Like to be quite honest,
And it's not
like because like what they wanted was like no fault divorce, like, and I was like, okay, why? Just as a person who's been married multiple times, I have been like, why would you, on earth would you phrase something in a way that makes it sound like you want state control over all kinship bonds? Because I can tell you that trying to sell that, for example, to indigenous tribes in the United States, it's not going to work because do I need to mention residential schools or stuff like that? Like that, and that's not even what they meant. I mean, like, you could talk about expanding the definition of family and achieve the same thing and not freak everybody out. But
like, if you don't want everyone to be in like boxes, like, just like a family that's like isolated from the rest of society, like, you expand the community, you have more third places, you build the socioeconomic relations that can actually allow for that. But like, no, it's just so stupid. And I cannot believe that some publishers will be comfortable putting stuff like that out and not other stuff because of optics, like, but yeah, like that we don't that's the impression I got reading Christopher Lash was that Christopher
Mhm.
Lash is kind of saying already how like the school system and the welfare state is already way too much. We're way too reliant on that replacing the family function for socialization. And Mark Fisher writes about this too, of course, like teachers kind of so much of like growing up is being outsourced to you know, social workers essentially. So it's like, what we want more of that exactly? And I know there's this idea that, oh, there's no such thing as the private sphere and stuff like that does make me nervous when I hear like, lefties talking about like, oh, they don't like trust the concept of civil society because that is like capitalism
Hmm.
and also like capitalism and also aspects of reactionary thought that are allowed to exist because of it, like religion and whatever. And I'm thinking like, well, how do you expect to overcome this other than having the state control everything? And I know anarchists will often be pro family abolition, but like, how do you actually achieve this without like the function? Who's going to replace these functions that you want to get rid of? Like they talk about collectives, right? But it's like, how is this going to happen? Everyone who's like critical, it's like this is the state control. I remember I saw like all the YouTube comments on one of like someone, a family abolition activist who is advocating this sort of stuff, and like all the comments are like, okay, this is going to mean total state control, and maybe in their heart of hearts the person talking genuinely doesn't want that, but it's like, how do you expect this to fucking happen? And it's like they'll say, oh, but
No,
like humans are cooperative species, look at like humans thousands of years ago, or even, let's look at indigenous groups that we actually don't try to study and understand and project all kind of weird noble savage myths on, you know we're egalitarian, and it ignores the whole part that like groups that live communistically partially do that because they have like, asabiya, as Ibn Khaldun would call. They have like a pre-existing social solidarity, partially because they grew up together. It's
right.
literally
And
you do that.
also, they tend, even when they're not blood related, they tend to talk about this in terms of kinship. Like your tribe is a kin tribe. And like, we even have concepts like this. I mean, you refer to your family, right? If you get married, you refer to your spouse as your family. Your spouse is not your kin, hopefully, at least not closely. But
Well, I don't
yeah,
know. You're the guy from the South, so you can tell
that's
me.
fair enough.
Sorry, I
But
just walked into that one.
but it is fascinating to me how we choose to frame this, and also like the way we decontextualize these demands. Like if you go back and read Babel's Women Under Socialism, it is not like kinder communism with everybody being raised by a state organ and trying to break all social bonds like it, create the state like it in the Republic, if Plato even meant that the way it reads. One of the reasons that I say that last part is because Plato clearly has esoteric stuff going on in there. And so some of the things are actually not to be read literally, but we've lost the keys for how to interpret that. But neither here nor there. That's not related to what you're talking about. But yeah, with stuff like that, actually, when I was a more conservative minded, and some of that stuff still gets me today. Like I really don't understand the weird sexual puritanism paired with sexual libertinism on the left. Like, because increasingly it's like, if there's any power differentials between you, and for some reason power is always defined as age, because I guess numbers are easy for people to understand, then there's a problem. And I'm like, well, okay, but how do you have any relationship that is that equal in an unequal society? Like, what do you seem to want us to be able to prefigure human equality in our relationships and nothing else. Or like stuff about consent and when consent applies and when it doesn't. And then who can consent? Because again, that gets pushed up and up and up too. Because I'm like, okay, so you want me to basically treat everybody for sexual consent like until they're like 25, basically, as being children? But then you also want me to not treat children. You want me to give children a whole lot of authority over all other aspects of their life. I'm very confused. And I was like that in my 20s too, except that it manifested by me going right wing. And so you're right. What actually sent me to the right wasn't so much love of the right. In fact, the anti-imperialism and a distrust of war. I'm not a pacifist, by the way. I've never been a pacifist, but I've always been like war is usually the health of the state, and it's not to the health of anyone in the state. And stuff like that. That stuff really, really pushed me towards the right. What pushed me away from the right is just the experience of being on the right, and also realizing that a lot of the stuff, and I say this all the time, but a lot of the dysfunction that I see on the left is not just also on the right, it's on the right in more profound ways. And also because the class alliance of the right is just as weird as the class alliance of the left. It's like the petite bourgeois middle class, parts of the working class that are not urbanized for the most part, and then the uber rich. It's like, wait, something about this allegiance doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. In America, which is like you only have two parties, so it's just kind of even more awkward because like the Democrats, you have like old money, then you have the like professional managerial types of like, which the right has this professional managerial types, but I noticed there are more people work in the fire industry, like the fire industries, finance, insurance, all that. And like the left, it's like academia, media, the liberal pinko.
That was one of my critiques of PMC, actually, was that fire is PMC, but they don't actually tend to have the kind of liberal cultural biases that we associate with the PMC.
Yeah, no, I think it's a different culture.
Except for HR.
The merchant right and the Brahmin left. I love this kind of framing that Piketty kind of uses. Because it's like the merchant right, it's like it is also PMC, but it's like for them, it's like we want like less bureaucracy, that'll fix everything.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Piketty's kind of using the way I think of it is like the true petite bourgeois versus the professionals who are quasi petite bourgeois. And by quasi, I mean, some of them are really petite bourgeois, but some of them are wage earners, but they have weird dependencies on the state. And then there's various levels of it. Like teachers and nurses, teachers are interesting because there are a lot of, actually, when everyone says there are a lot of radical teachers, I actually don't know that many. Maybe I'm in the wrong areas of the country.
Huh? In like you're talking about like high school, not
like
high
school teachers, not like university. Absolutely, there's lots of there. Universities are radical identity liberals, but they are moderate liberals on everything else, particularly in economic policy. Like, so I have people who would celebrate. Like, I'm not going to name in case this professor listens to it, but I had a professor of color who was not Black, and that is actually important, who would celebrate like the fact that the United States is going to be majority minority by 2050, at least it was according to 2012 projections, but would also mock people for being poor. So it was like, what?
Just as smart as white kids. The ultimate
right
Freudian, the ultimate slip of Biden there, which there's a lot to analyze in that, not just beyond.
Oh, yeah.
You can also, it gets at a contradiction in the way we think of a race too, but that's another topic of its own.
I mean, it's one of these. Go ahead.
What were you about to go off of?
I was just about to say that what most people, both right and left in America, think the United States is like majority of color now. Like if you see poll after poll about that, because the way we put race first in the media, and while it is a lot more color than it used to be, in every single age category, and in every demographic category, and particularly on income, the largest category is still going to be white in every single instance. Now, yes, Black people are disproportionately poor and disproportionately targeted by cops. But I remember one of not Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison saying, when someone just shoots a white kid in the back, I will feel like we might have racial justice in the world or something like this. And she said this in 2013. It was right after Trayvon Martin. And I was like, people shoot white kids in the back who are innocent all the time. Like, they don't shoot them because they're white. Right. At least very rarely. So you got that. But like, just, it's delusional and it proves that you're not really paying attention to the overall stats if you don't think it happens, particularly if you're poor and if you are mentally unwell. Your race is not going to be the biggest tell. I mean, actually in the United States, the three groups that are most likely killed by cops indigenous first, and we've only recently started really talking about that. Then black people. Black people are such a bigger part of our population that it might make sense that it's a bigger concern. But the biggest is just anybody who has a mental illness, like very likely to get killed by cops. And I have been shocked that the way that we have framed this, not just like particularly on the center left, but even sometimes on the far left, is like any chance to build solidarity to certain groups, say poor cis white men, or poor cis men in general. We always, in fact, using the idea of poor cis white men to not do anything to help poor men, regardless of their race, is super common. And people then wonder, like, well, why are all these even men of color becoming reactionary all of a sudden? Well, you've literally said there's no place for them, and their life is getting worse and worse.
Mm-hmm. There was
What do you
a
think is
study
going to
in the
happen?
early 2000s called the neglected voter. It was like a political science study, and it was about the blue collar white man. And like it sounds like, oh well, white people's feelings. And I'm always skeptical. Like I've always liked this kind of I like to often judge, at least when it comes to politics, truths also by their effects, and by their potential effects. Like I think it's just if a lot of people thought like you just thought that way, it would be things would be a little less stupid when our discourse on the left, because it's one of those things that like even if it was, which I don't think is true to like why you should just think that like poor white dudes are privileged. Like, okay, are you gonna play the oppression Olympics? Like, of course, poor black people are even like less privileged than poor white people. But it's like we can go down the line. We want to get disabled people. Want to get like just like Norm Finkelstein at this moment when he said, "You know who's also oppressed? Ugly people." I mean, it's true. We have ample evidence that, like, there's a whole book on this called Sexual Capital. There is tons of like, if we go down this line, I mean, it's just so unhelpful. You know what I mean? And like, it is like there's this view that like a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is like, oh, poor like white men reactionary, and if you try to appeal to them, you're tailing you're tailing reactionaries, or you're just whatever. It's just so silly. I think at this point, a lot of people have kind of woke up to like this with a second Trump victory, but some haven't, just because I see a lot of people blaming everything on white supremacy all over again.
I think you're going to see academia in particular being the least responsive, but also, and my reasons for saying this isn't just cultural, it's political economy. The influence of academia in the United States, anyway, I'm not going to speak for Europe or Canada on this one, but is declining relatively quickly as far as like its ability to attract new students who stay in the country. And there's a variety of reasons for that. It's not all good. We're not replacing it with anything. It's when I hear stories about like, oh, well, you can end up pretty poor from going to college. I'm like, yeah, but statistically speaking, if you're blue collar, you're fucked no matter what you do here. So, make those decisions as you will. But I do think there has been, I have a lot of like, I was talking to like a blue collar origins, pink haired queer woman who went into academia. And she's like shocked a lot of the times because she's just like, these people are the people sorting everybody, and yet they pretend that they believe in equality, but their ways of achieving equality is stuff like meta studies, which is like, oh, look at the cunning of poor people. And I'm like, isn't it funny that what that means is you can valorize the poor but change nothing, and also be the primary social economic sorting system, and then say that you are somehow egalitarian while you're meeting your racial quotas by recruiting from out of country. And, and you also have felt empowered to literally do stuff like diversity statements so you could get past anti-discrimination laws to sort of prop a bunch of people up. And look, I will say this, like academia for a long time talked a good game and was super fucking white. And now it isn't. And it's talking a lot of the same game. But it is crazy to me to think, and it's a total misrecognition of your own power, if nothing else, to think that you can socially engineer without having the general public on your side, and then also not really having the money powers or the government are the governing classes on your side, except in part of one party, and think that it's going to go well for you when things shift at all. And under Trump, that has led to all kinds of crazy things. I mean, one of the things to me that the Trump administration, the first one and the second one, and they're very different from each other in a lot of ways. I mean, we can see that clearly. But one of the things that the Trump administration, the first one, proved to me was that there are a lot of people who are relatively well off who woke up for symbolic reasons. And what the second Trump administration has taught me is, now that the stakes are real, that a lot of those people are nowhere to be found and just want to talk about the same talking points they talked about in 2016 or in 2014. You know, like, if you're pretending to be Tim Wise, who was one of those first anti-racist, proto CRT brought to the public people, then you want to still talk like that in 2025, you have to explain why that's not even very popular amongst blue-collar Black people of any variety.
Never was.
No,
Never was. And I hate, this is a big disconnect. So like, this is a weird point for someone like me to bring up, and the fact that I have to preface this that's saying, as a non-Black person, to speak about the fact that I have to say that says that's about the culture. But like, look, I was always, I'm like a hip hop head, right? So like, those who listen to the show, I've followed hip hop and hip hop media for a very long time, and what you could call like Black media, or if you want to use that term, urban media, is the wokes like to call it, used to call it, like watching the Boondocks and stuff and like all that. And I never found like a lot of the kind of sentiments that I heard from like university campus reflected in that at all. I would always hear like certain sentiments that I just wouldn't see reflected in what I was actually consuming, which of course that also doesn't, like, Black media doesn't also represent all Black people, right? And like, I do find it interesting though that like so much of like the kind of things that people would be preoccupied with in academia when it came to anti-racism, which was all around statues. It was around changing names of things. It was around like sensitivity about like teaching history in a way that was more accommodating to different groups. I didn't see anyone care about that. And also what I didn't see is stuff like abolish the police. I did not see that anywhere. And like, it's not a popular idea, and it does not reflect it even in the advocacy of the 90s, leading up to the crime bill. But like, what is the obvious thing is like, people are pissed off with police brutality, of course. People are pissed off by like, cops racially profiling, right? That's what they're pissed off. But no one actually, when they said fuck the police, they're not saying abolish the police. No, like rarely do people make that. Some people make that, but they're usually in universities. And I saw like this was with the BLM protests. It was mostly like white people, like white students who would make these sort of arguments and say like it's on behalf of Black people. And I thought like, damn, like this is like this, of course, I wasn't surprised at all when I saw Trump was doing better with Black people. In fact, this is my prediction: is that if like there were no racists at all in the Republican Party, because there still are, they would actually maybe even win the Black vote. I think there's a couple of reasons why they don't, and it's because of the Civil Rights Act. That's the older generation remembers that, and they have rational reasons to distrust the Republicans. And also, like, the fact that there still are racists in the Republicans. I mean, like, Elon Musk fucking. I don't think Elon Musk's a Nazi, okay? But like, come on, like, he definitely has white supremacist sympathies, and he's like on the front stage. The fact that he's even joking about that, even if he was joking, we know it's not really clear. Even if he was joking, it's still like you're just alienating so much of the minority vote there. So it's like I really believe if the Republicans turned into like this actually post-racial party, they would probably win.
Well, I mean, the one thing I would say that you have to look at in the Black community in the United States is that municipal government employment for Black men w- after deindustrialization is the primary form of employment, statistically speaking, and then in the services. So there is some allegiance to what we might call the lower rung of the administrative state at like the state level. But that's not true for Latin men at all. For one of the things that I think is always wild to me is when we talk about minorities, what most people speak about on the left, they're really talking about educated Black women. That's that's the attitude and image they have in their head. That's not really reflective of the general community and never has been. On on issues, but even that demographic group, while they're strongly aligned with the Democrats and they're strongly aligned with academia, they have never been particularly given to even calling themselves progressives. Now, it is true that in the United States, like the communists, particularly the Communist Party of the United States before the New Deal, did make a lot of inroads into the Black community because no one was making any inroads into the Black community at all. And the other inroads were Republicans until the second FDR administration. And that's when the Northern Black vote flipped. We can't really talk about the Southern Black vote because there really wasn't one. I mean, in the South, the Black vote went to the Democrats sometimes. But one of the things that made me a paleoconservative, that also is one of the reasons why I am a socialist today, is about what I saw happening, because I lived in a majority Black city with majority Black leadership. And what we often saw was elites within that community being able to fight white elites by claiming racial stuff, but then often, frankly, liquidating their own community in all quotation marks, because what really was happening is they weren't of the same community. There was profound class differences and class interests here. And the racial element, just like with white people, was being used to basically shut down any discussion of corruption within like the Black congressional leadership at the state level in Georgia. And it's known, for example, that the Black congressional caucuses cut deals with the most conservative Republicans so that when things reshuffled, when a lot of the old Dixiecrats who finally were holding out flipped sides and became Republicans in 2000 and 2004 in a lot of the southern states, they cut deals with the Black congressional caucus so Black representatives could keep seats, but that the Democrats would never have a chance to gain votes there. By strategically respecting historical minority communities, but diffusing other liberal and left-wing sentiment in the area. So in my head, and this is something that's been consistent throughout my life, I've seen elites in both these communities, like, yeah, they hate each other and they're at this weird cultural war that's almost like a cultural civil war at this point, but they're also collaborating with each other to make sure that economic change is damn near impossible. And that interestingly moved me to the right, then moved me to the left when I realized there was a kind of left I could be on. But at the same token, I will also say this. I mean, I was shocked by the response to Adolf Fried by some people in the DSA and stuff like that, because I'm like, Adolf Fried's not even asking you to not vote for a Democrat. Well, he's not even asking you to stop the Popular Front. He's just asking you. He's just asking you to admit that if you took care of economic problems, a lot of the systemic racial problems would go away. Whereas if you take care of the racial problems alone, you exacerbate racial attitudes and make economic stuff harder to fix.
100%. I mean, I don't know why that's not obvious, because like race is a construct, class is a material relation. Like, duh. One thing I hate though is when leftists do the thing where they try to like act like this is only a problem with liberals. Because
Mhm.
in my view, like all intersectionality often ends up being politically, because intersectionality is an analysis, kind of different from how intersectionality manifests in political rhetoric and policy. Those people will say, well, the problem with that is that they didn't include class. We believe in intersectionality, which includes race, class, gender, sex, all of this together. And it's like, okay, you're including like some relationships, uh, some categories that are like constructs and some that are just not, and kind of acting like they're all on the same level of priority, and also at the level, not just priority, but at the level of like what you can mobilize people on. Because it's this like intersectionality is useful at a level of demographic analysis,
Yeah.
but at the level of like politics, I think it's absurd to think that that is like. And this is the issue. I do really think I know you have some skepticism of the PMC, but like frankly, I don't really care if it's a class or not. For me, it's like so real as a category, just because all the people who are most insistent about this approach to politics are people who have a direct interest in social climbing. Like it's almost as if like they get more social capital by saying race, gender, class. Say it with me. Like it's like a ritual. It's really odd to see. And I'll see like white dudes who couldn't like, who are so clearly trying to like social climb, who will take this approach, and then they'll to knock off the rivals. They'll say, "Oh, that's a class reductionist. That's a class reductionist. They're bad for the movement. You got to kick them out." And I know like if this sounds so 2016, right?
Mhm.
But I think in 2016, a lot of people had like a more, I would say, a less intelligent kind of approach to talk about these problems that led to a whole like phenomenon of wokeism or whatever. But it's like at this point, if I see people on Twitter debating whether wokeism is a thing, and we can debate whether like that's a good term for it or what wokeism is. But to deny like when people say there isn't like wokeism, they're kind of just saying it's not a problem and that there isn't a problem.
Right.
The left.
And
We've acknowledged so far, and most people would acknowledge that the right is a reaction. And most of us would agree that the right's a reaction to deindustrialization and neoliberalism, or at least part of the more worker and petite bourgeois side of the reactionaries, right? But like, what else are they reacting to? We can't act like it's just neoliberalism. That's a big part of it. But like you said, I only became part of the left when I realized there was a left to be on. And it reminds
right.
me of one of my working class friends who I went to high school with, because I went to public high school where I could see a lot of class contradictions. It was really interesting. And I remember I was trying to like convince him to like not vote for the Conservative Party because they weren't going to do anything for him. And he told me like, well, when I try to like when I hear about the left and I see what the left is, all I hear is like middle class. I hear middle class or upper middle class white women who make way more money than I do telling me that I'm privileged. And
Mhm.
this is like right when Bernie is like launching his run, 2016,
Mhm.
before he's officially running. And in Canada, we don't have anything like that, right? So we have like a NDP party that's used to be a social democrat party that's now a totally like PMC-fied woke progressive party with some social democratic characteristics. So I couldn't say anything to really refute him, because I was like, well, he's like, I like what you have to say, but with the left, that the party, they don't speak that language. They don't offer that. What could I tell
Let
him?
me
That was like a moment for me when even then I was like, yeah, like something's got to change in the left, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is I think because I'm critical of right-wing playlists, people often think that I somehow think that we can make concessions with the Democrats or whatever. In fact, if I was to tell you why I thought the situation in America under Trump is the way it is, I actually think it's the long array of choices made by the Democrats, particularly after the Civil Rights Act. And it's not just their embrace of neoliberalism from 1978 forward. It is also the fact that they have clearly been wedded to this idea of a meritocratic elite that you address racism by just diversifying the demographics represented within the elite as if it somehow trickles down to the rest of society. And that will make it all okay. And to me, that's nuts on a variety of reasons, because it's like, it's not just non-intersectional or whatever the fuck that means. It's also very much like, if we had a feudal system with like 30% black lords, even though there's only 19% black population, that'd be good. And I'm like, what? Where there's been a lot of stoking of fire, and the fact that it leads to things like African descendants of slaves only calls for reparations, which have died down, but was very big at the end of, shouldn't surprise people. And that would break down racial solidarity amongst people, people who aren't white, also shouldn't surprise people, because that has very much happened too. And just shaming people for being bigots doesn't really work. Now, I admit all these words are like, we were talking about wokeism. We're talking about everyone playing a Monty Bailey game. You got the people playing, oh, we don't know what work means. I'm like, but you did know what woke meant like 4 years ago. You just mysteriously forgot. Are the conservatives who are like call any form of concern about racial fairness, wokeness too? The problem that you have though is like, we all know that this is the game that's going to get played. Like, before it was woke, it was politically correct. Before it was politically correct, actually that was the one that I remember the most. But
They're connected.
Yeah, they're directly connected. They mean pretty much the same thing.
I want to pitch you after my theory of wokeism is anti-materialist, anti-politics, but I'll let you finish. And and then we'll take a break, bathroom break after. Yeah.
Right. No, I also think there's like hiding behind what these words mean. So like, you and I can argue about PMC. Here's what I'll tell you. There is a professional managerial social class. In fact, my only problem with calling it professional managerial is it's really just professionals, and managements are mostly a fire and they vary on where they stand, except for HR. HR is weird. But yeah, like it's absolutely true that there are working class trans people and working class people with blue hair. What is not true is that there's a ton of working class people that have the ability or even knowledge to particularly if we define working class as not college educated, which almost every demographic thing in America does, even though I'm not sure that that's actually a good definition. But nonetheless, people cannot keep up with the constantly shifting social codes around this. And they've accelerated, like, from the 90s through the aughts, there was an expansion of these social codes, but the terms were mostly static, except around the edges of sexuality and gender.
There's a lot of things, directions in which we could take this, because I did want to get your take on Trump's like tariffs and his Gaza plan. The thing is like, what I always find more interesting, actually, because is talking about like the left, just because I think. What do you think of people who react to criticisms of left by saying, "Well, this is helping the right, and that we just need to unify. This is not the time for self-criticism. We need to unify around Trump." And I find it like an interesting conception of how change works, because they think that like the implicit assumption is that if you just have everyone get in line, the left get in line, if you purge the people of the reactionaries, you just have the left good. Get everyone, unify against the right, you'll defeat the right. And I kind of think like in a country like America where frankly, I just I don't really believe in the kind of idea of like a far right in the sense that I think like both the parties are right wing. and like the Republicans are just more right wing. But I don't. Someone who, like for a lot of the left, still they'll be critical of the Democrats. Even for the first time in a while, I noticed with Palestine, they even actually many decided not to vote. Many did, but like many vocally more than I saw last time with Biden or Clinton decided to not cast their vote. I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe the left is breaking from the Democrats finally, or just at least not like being totally reliant. But even then, like it's like the Democrats, oh, we don't like them, but the Republicans, oh. And I kind of think the still mentality, they treat like Republicans as if they're like so different from the Democrats, like to such an extent where this is literally like the right and left in the French Revolution. Like it's a kind of, and I don't know. I think like we need to, if one wants to play the electoral game, which is really difficult in the United States, you're gonna have to like reckon with the possibility of either, because if it's a difficult thing, like you really just got two parties. You're gonna have to like reckon with the possibility of, if not either running people in both parties, at the very least, appealing to people who vote for both parties.
Yeah.
A go cross constituency. Because, like, this idea of, like, oh, uniting the left, even if we did that, like, how much of the percentage of the population would that be? Like,
If you even included all the progressives and then all the far left together, you might have 5 to 10 at most. If I had the most expansive definition off of what I saw in the Pew polls, 15% of the population. And it would be, frankly, despite the fact that all the leadership would be women of color, it would be the rightest portion of the population, according to every stat I've ever seen. What I will say is this is actually why I think tailism is so strange. Like if you were an independent poll, a true independent poll, and you were known to either work with both parties but have like your own interests that you were able to articulate. The other thing it means is the other parties know that you are both competition but could be a tactical ally. Whereas right now, you're either captured or subversive no matter what you do.
mhm.
If you don't do anything, you are captured. You don't have any negotiation stance because you're loyal to a point that what can you do? You're not going to threaten to leave. You're not going to vote for the other side no matter what. You're not even going to sit on your hands.
We'll push the
If
left.
right, push them left how? Like just I tell people just do the most basic form of game theory and think about this. In the world you've set up, the left can go nowhere, but the center right in the party can change sides. Who now has negotiating power? And you clearly saw that during the Biden administration.
And they did kind of push him left, but to what end? All that did is
Right.
now the right thinks of your establishment. Like,
Right.
look at what that did to Bernie Sanders' credibility, which he's trying to now pretend that like that whole period didn't happen. Which, look, I'm sympathetic to Bernie. I really like Bernie. I don't think that was gonna like I don't think he's ever gonna win, or if he was gonna win, he would get anything done with his current approach. But like, come on, like the idea of like, okay, even if we do push him left, what that does is now the people who might have gone to your side, who are like not total far rightists, but who are people, like this is a phenomenon in France too, I noticed, with the left's willingness to work with Macron against the right.
Mhm.
It seems to backfire. Like everyone was so excited about the France's, popular front victory, right? Victory. And I think like I remember when I first heard that, yes, Macron didn't accept the results and like you appointed a right wing prime minister. But I'm thinking if the left was actually that strong, they could totally protest that. That's France. Like it's France. Like if the
Mhm.
left was actually strong, had a basis, that shit Macron couldn't do that shit. So obviously, like this is not a working strategy. It's like it seems like if they like this whole how get Le Pen out no matter what, it seems to just procrastinate like the inevitability of Le Pen.
And also, it's like
Because they
I'm gonna
lost
say
the
so
working class vote. Like, I want to emphasize, they lost the working class vote.
oh, yeah.
Right,
I was
won the
looking
working
at the
class vote.
polls.
That's crazy.
I was looking at the poll. Well, I mean, this has been a thing with left populist parties across the globe, is we can actually talking about it for all the quote multipolarity of all this shit. What we've seen as left parties in particular have been Americanized. And by that I mean they increasingly appeal to a strata of urbanites and professionals. Yes, there are some working class urbanites, like there were in the Corbyn being an example of that. But I pointed this out in 2018 that, like, for the first time in memory, even during New Labor, all right, even Blair still had more of a working class vote outside of London than Corbyn did. Yes, there was a lot of working class in London. But again, you have this weird phenomenon where the only place that you see a working class left is a place where the Mandarin left is in power, which also means if they're not willing to break from the Mandarin left, to use your terminology, but I like it right now.
Brahmin left.
The Brahmin left, Mandarin left, Brahmin left, all the same to me.
Mandarin for a second there.
The Brahmin left, excuse me, to use, I guess Mandarin left is anti-Chinese. If you're not willing to break with them, then you are stuck. And you have a big old target on your back too, because the moment anything goes wrong at all, I don't know if you're Corbyn not being able to figure out a good response to Brexit, for example, you are then easily targeted. And yes, they attacked him with bullshit anti-Semitism claims and stuff like that. But I'm also start to think, like, what does it say, right? Like, particularly with Corbyn. Corbyn's a good example of this. I will have, leftists go, well, Corbyn's more, Corbyn lost with more than Starmer won with. And I'm like, yeah, but that actually should be more damning to Corbyn than you think. If Corbyn couldn't put together a coalition with more support than Starmer has won with, what does that tell you? And this has been true across the board. France is very interesting. I saw something that was terrifying to me. I was looking at the 20% of the vote the left has in France, which, okay, better than we have still, but France Unbowed's becoming less and less popular by the moment. And I even saw like an 8% approval rating for Francois Hollande and a return to the old socialist. And I'm like, are you guys speed running Greece? Like, holy crap. Now, I will say this, all the left, the quote left populist, Mélenchon's the one I like the most. But it doesn't matter. They're not seen as being willing to fully stand up or break with Macron. And so what power do they really have? Because the other thing you can say is, for all the attacks on democracy that we're seeing under Trump, and I do think we're seeing a lot of real ones. I want to be very clear on that. I'm not as sanguine on that as other people. But we see how the center maintains power, and Macron has done the same bullshit that Trump, I mean, like, basically the French is in a constitutional crisis that could literally end the Fifth Republic, and we might get a sixth one. So and the other thing I can say is, like, a lot of people have said, oh, well, the right populists haven't really stood up to the Atlanticists and the EU. And I'm like, yeah, but they're kind of, they don't have a grounds for which to cohere an international policy. But if France or Germany fall, then they do. So who knows what all this means? What has been very clear to me in the United States, and maybe this will be our last talking point, though, is the idea that we all just need to align behind the progressives. The progressives aren't fighting. Like, we're not getting, I'm actually surprised. Like there are some people who haven't gotten the memo about hashtag resistance being not a thing, but you can definitely see the congressional Democrats are not trying to do much of anything, even though they are necessary for Trump to get some of his stuff through Congress. Because to get an appropriations bill, you're going to need at least 5-10 Democrats to sign on in the House and Senate, because the GOP actually has a very, 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 very narrow hold. And yet I heard Hakeem Jeffries act like they've lost all sense of government and can do nothing, while a large part of the Democratic Party is actually signing on to Trumpist laws. So what are you supposed to make of that?
Literally
So it's very
before the election too.
Mhm.
Like Tim Walz was like trying to debate with JD Vance, saying like, well, we tried to do your policy and you guys didn't want to implement it. We did everything you wanted. You're not really sincere about the border. We're sincere about the border. And meanwhile, the left, it's like, you know, talking about fighting fascism, voting out fascism. And it's like, dude, the border policy, it's like the Democrats on the border policy, very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I don't know what we're gonna see here. I mean, basically right now we're relying on governors to keep the governors and lawyers to keep any constitutional order together whatsoever. And I'm not like a huge fan of the US Constitution. I'm not one of these constitution worshipers, but we are heading directly towards a constitutional crisis. And one that when other countries have headed towards it in the past, it is resolved by the military. So make of that what you will.
I I have a certain prediction.
Mm-hmm.
So, like this is where I think we'd both disagree pretty heavily with like some of those who have been very optimistic about Trump's turn. I think Trump is going to be the most anti-free speech president we've seen in a long time, because we already see it with his, Israel, like his anti-Semitism crackdown,
Yeah.
right? And what is really concerning is the willingness of like these big tech companies to now like go on with whatever he's doing in a way as a way to appease him. Partially, probably because I think they're afraid of like antitrust. They don't like that element of the Republican Party, which is like kind of more in Vance. Vance talks about wanting to break up all the companies, Teddy Roosevelt
Mhm.
style. I think they were a little worried about that, so they're like rushing to all appease Trump, and they're doing like stuff like seems kind of like ridiculous and unnecessary, but they're like removing holidays that were like for gay people or LGBT. I don't know. It was just kind of seemed kind of odd. Like they were just like very like clearly trying to appease him. But this is the more dangerous thing that I predict. So like you do see historically like the most anti-communist crackdowns. Well, actually, it happened to the Democrats too. Never mind. But like the I do there. I could imagine like a sort of anti-communist bill in which they try to like on the guise of extremism, right? Trying to
Mhm.
crack down extremism, that they actually like straight up ban communist stuff online. And Google's willingness to cooperate is kind of what seems dangerous, because I mean they sure did that with like anti-Israel content, like on
Yeah.
Facebook. But
No, I mean the big tech platforms.
there's a thing though. I've predicted this for a while, because I would think I thought that like I just didn't think it would happen so soon, because the left is so impotent, and like there aren't really communists. Okay, like
Mhm.
not very many communists, but if there was a radical left movement, that would happen. So like this is why I told people for a while, like the idea of openly identifying is like Marxist, Leninist, anarchist, these sort of labels, and like using all the iconography to make it so obvious for anyone to ban you. Having a fucking Lenin avatar as your profile picture, which is okay if you live halfway across the world, maybe, and you're anonymous. But like in the first world, or anywhere where you're actually like subject to censorship, that is a foolish idea. And I've learned this talking to some of my friends in Mexico, which is that like they were used to like government repression from before because they lived with, the PRI in the
The
pan.
PRI and the PAN would both censor like leftist stuff. Absolutely.
So like they kind of left had a habit of like being very careful with its speech, and now like the left sort of like assimilated all in AMLO and some outside of it, but like they've kind of been much more strategic, you know?
Mhm.
Whereas like this kind of, I know it's a lot of it's LARPy. That's the thing. A lot of it seems insincere, which is like why would I would tell if I was trying to like convince CIA people to not crack down on communists. I'd be like, these guys are just nihilistic Bernie bros. You don't have to. It's really not a threat. But they make it too easy. That's the kind of stupid thing. Like I do wonder, like, just
So
what
yeah,
is that we've been taking our free speech for granted. I really do think so. And the left
yeah.
has enabled this by kind of saying like, "Oh, we support banning fascists on the internet or whatever," which okay, in principle, sure, but like we all know that gets stretched. What gets defined as that is ambiguous. So it's like if you're for banning certain groups politically, that's not a good legitimation story for then like for you to run with because it's so easily used against you, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I this is one of the things that I agreed with Doug Lane on and still do. I didn't think it was as important as he does, but I will say this: the tech people are willing to censor on political pressure because they're afraid of Lena Khan. And if we actually look at the story of Lena Khan, it's actually quite interesting. Yes, she was a Biden appointee, but her big win was an antitrust legislation against Google that was instigated by Trump's order. So, ironically, the thing that has made big tech craking its boots, both playing with the Democrats and playing with Trump, is the idea that we're actually going to enforce antitrust law and go back to pre Carter antitrust standards, because that's what Lena Khan really wanted to do. That's a pretty clear reading of the law. We haven't really been doing that through jurisprudential wizardry since the late 70s. And it looked like that was back on order. The other thing I'll say with the tech overlords, and I think this is true for Elon particularly than the other ones, Elon made his way up in the world through government contracts. What is he trying to destroy? The ability for people to get government contracts. There is a certain amount of these people wanting to kick the ladder they climbed up on out from under them to remove competition too. So there's both a carrot and a stick here. It does make Trump kind of weird because, Trump's great enemies until this administration, even up into this administration, were the tech billionaires. And his policy seemed to be about undermining that and returning to an industrial policy. He isn't doing that now. He's not talking that way now. It does seem like the Bannon strategy has been adopted, but the content is Elon, not Bannon. And that means a lot of people trying to guess what's going to happen, which is, I hear people making all kinds of predictions about what's going to happen under Trump. And my response is increasingly, I don't fucking know, because the coalition under Trump is at odds with each other. And it is only unified in the personage of Trump. And as Trump actually has to make decisions to implement policy, it will de-unify certain things. I will admit that I underestimated the Project 2025 shit, which he's doing some of, because I thought there's no way Trump's going to want to divide his own base. But I also then kind of thought maybe the blitz isn't just for the quote left or the liberals or the Democrats, because obviously they barely are able to stand up even under normal times. Maybe the blitz is actually about the fact that if he does it fast enough, he can avoid a civil war in his own base. Because I can guarantee you there's a lot of stuff Elon wants to do that the MAGA people do not actually want. And it's not just the H-1B visas where it first showed up. You're going to see it on stuff like, after Elon, you started seeing RFK Jr., former proponent of universal healthcare, talking about privatizing Medicaid and Medicare. Like stuff that Trump has said won't happen. And so there's a kind of...
They already cut Medicare, right? I always mix the two up. There's one of them is for like really poor people, one's for old people. I always mix.
Medicaid is for is for poor people. Medicare is for old people. Medicaid got cut, but then got kind of reestablished. But it's actually chaos. We don't know what's going to do. And I will say this: the Doge thing, they are assuming powers that constitutionally they don't have.
Mhm.
Presidential political appointees do not have the power of the purse. And while people will try to justify this as an audit, the results of that audit will not be known to the public under Presidential Records Act until like 30 years in the future. So it's not really a public accountability thing either, because we can't know the results of what they're finding. If they choose to tell us, that's one thing, but we can't even verify that that's true. So there's a lot going on right now in terms of constitutional crisis. I do think that the people who were like, well, Trump will be an epoch defining president, they're right. It will be. I just think what I think we're going to see is that what comes after is going to be very interesting and very strange. And there's a lot of contradictions and tensions emerging everywhere. Would love to believe that the Democrats would go the way of the Whigs. So when people, listen to me, they was like, oh, Varn, you're friendly to the Democrats. I don't want them to exist anymore. I blame them for what's going on in a deep way. Even stuff like over relying on the courts, that was begun by the Democrats in a very progressive court. And they managed to hold on to it by luck, by civil libertarian appointed by conservatives voting with liberal justices for about 20, 30 years longer than would have been predicted. Because the majority of the Supreme Court has been appointed by a Republican presidential candidate for a long time. And it wasn't just, under Trump, like Sandra Day O'Connor and Breyer and Stevens, they were all conservative appointees. But what's become clear is Trump might even be at odds with the conservative courts, and you already see J.D. Vance signaling this. So I think there's a lot to be worried about, and I think it's naive to think that it's going to be good. I also think a lot of the most dangerous stuff Trump is going to do, unfortunately, is legal. Crazy tariffs. He could 100% tariff everything legally on his own prerogative, really.
Do you think he'll abandon that? Because he always talks about William McKinley. William McKinley, how it made us so rich. William McKinley's tariffs. We had so much money, we didn't know what to do with it. But William McKinley, then we abandoned the tariff strategy.
And now he's undoing them seemingly just because the Democrats normalized them. Like when you think about stuff like Taiwan, like the massive chip import we're putting on Taiwan, it's actually going to be very hard for anybody to make chips outside of NVIDIA. And maybe even them, because also the CHIPS Act got impounded unconstitutionally, I may add, probably. I shouldn't say that with full confidence, because who knows what the Supreme Court would say. But under current understanding of the law, there we go, that's my cover, it would be unconstitutional. And against legislative diktats too, because the Impoundment Act was actually passed in response to Nixon doing the same thing in the 70s. But there were Supreme Court precedents even before that was very clear that, well, stuff appropriated by Congress needs to be pointed out. But again, we can't just blame Trump here, because the beginnings of not enforcing federal law really started to happen under Obama, because Obama didn't push for the Democrats to change U.S. drug law. When the states started changing their drug laws, he just did this thing where he decided to sit on it and not enforce federal law. And now that's a possibility for all kinds of stuff. So that road was, one of my most unpopular opinions during the Obama administration was that DACA was a good policy, but that it was unconstitutional because it was an executive order, and you can't force things like the issuing of government IDs without legislative acts. And the Supreme Court kind of did split the baby. It was the Supreme Court ruling on DACA is no, you can't issue IDs or rationalize appearance without congressional action, but you can not enforce the law as the executive by your executive prerogative, which is one of the reasons why this is getting expanded. But it's funny to me that anyone would pretend that anyone in the U.S. gives a shit about our Constitution anymore, because like doesn't really function at this point. And how we've been fixing the Constitution is basically either Supreme Court fiat are literally norms that elites just agreed to, and without passing rules to write them into law. So we'll see how it stands up. But the left, I don't know what the left can do. Like, for example, left really cares about Palestine, and a lot of people were like, and this is one thing where which leftists would just shut the fuck up for a little while. Just period. I don't mean like shut up on a principle stance. I'm tired of hearing them. I mean like just wait before you fucking talk. But I'll give you my example of this. People were like, "Oh, those voters in Michigan were completely right in supporting Trump." And I'm like, they were completely right on a moral basis, regardless of what Trump does. But this idea, but people were immediately were like, "Oh, well, Trump is going to get us peace in Palestine." And I was like, "Are you nuts?" And so every few days, I watch people flip in the wind about how to respond to what Trump's doing on Palestine. You know what the funny thing is, actually, is conservatives I know actually are more principled on what they believe one way or the other. They're a lot more anti-Zionist conservatives now than there used to be.
Oh yeah.
And the Zionists are also very consistent, and they're getting very annoyed with not being able to figure out where the fuck Trump actually is on any of this. Whereas I see people trying to justify, like, oh, Trump's going to be better for Palestine, Trump's going to be worse. And I'm like, I have no idea. But what I can tell you is right now it's not looking good. I don't know how he builds his coalition. It might just be talk. But I can tell you that the police powers granted to the presidency under the treaties it introduced into the UN and the War Powers Act of the 1970s means that he can commit troops to Gaza without congressional support for up to 90 days. And are you going to pull the funding for troops under fire once they're under fire? It's literally never happened. So,
Yeah. I think too many people also, because like, look, there's this view that Trump will also be good for the left because he'll revive the left. And I don't really think that's necessarily true because that all depends on the left. I think certainly people will be more open to like other things for sure. Like you're going to have a lot of disaffected Republicans, disaffected MAGA people. We're going to leave. Like it's going to be a shit show. That's my prediction. Although you never know. Maybe what if he does universal health care? I doubt that. But like, I think what I've seen a lot in Canada as well is that like people shifting away from the conservatives, but not to the left, to liberals again. Because like maybe
right.
people would actually vote for liberals if they just weren't so damn cringe and actually like not completely out of touch. So like don't necessarily bank on like the accelerationist thesis of like, Trump, propelling socialism. Because look, I think a lot of left hide behind the fact that there's no left party in America. There's Democrats and Republicans. So it's easy for them to say, this is the left. They're not real leftists. It doesn't represent us, blah, blah, blah. Okay, look, in Canada, what I thought was really interesting is that the Trump
Mhm.
tariffs seem to like unify Canadians more than ever. But also another interesting phenomenon is like I know Chris Catrone wrote his article on like why not Greenland, and he made the claim that like Trump saying Canada should become a 51st state and mocking Trudeau, that like that was why Trudeau stepped down, which that isn't why, but like Trudeau was very unpopular leading up to that, very unpopular, and it's why he stepped down. But like now the liberals just suddenly climbed up in the polls dramatically. And I mean, they have a new guy, Mark Carney, is kind of like projected to be the leader, sort of neutral bureaucrat type guy, former central banker, kind of like bland white guy, our Joe Biden, you could say, with like without Alzheimer's. But like the liberals have suddenly rose in popularity. They didn't go to the left. A lot of the people didn't like Polyev because there's this comparison people make that to Trump. People often compare him to Trump, even though he's actually not like Trump. But like people in Canada hated Trump before. Now they really hate Trump. And there's a lot of people who are like, we don't want anything that even resembles Trump. So there's a kind of like weird like climb of the liberals, and but it didn't go to the left. The NDP have been declining just as much as they were before. Like, they were
Mhm.
projected to get second place because of how bad Trudeau was popularity-wise, but now that's no longer true. The Conservatives no longer even look like they might get a majority anymore. They might just get a minority. They could even lose. I doubt that, but, it's looking, like, closer, and the NDP didn't gain anything from this. That says so much. Like, that says so much that, like, the rebirth of Canadian nationalism, if you wanna say, like, a kind of very short-lived probably
Mhm.
short-lived revival of, like, Canadian pride that's Trump has stoked. It did not come from the left or the right. It came from the kind of, like, center, like, liberals, and that is a failing of the left in my view because, when you have an opportunity like that, the fact that they didn't gain any popularity, it shows they're the problem. Like, they
Yeah.
are the problem, and I'm so sick and tired of it. And, yeah, like, when Trump fucks up, I don't think we should assume people will just go become Marxists or whatever, you know?
No. No, I mean, who knows? I mean, like, one of the things that Trump has done in America is made us forget how unpopular, deadly, and dangerous George W. Bush was.
Oh, and the liberals wanna act like he was good?
Yeah, I know. And we saw them make a pretty terrible mistake trying to ride that around with the whole Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney thing, which, and my idea is like people I don't like hanging out with a supervillain that I consider worse than Trump in most ways, to be quite frank. Definitely has a lot more blood on his hands, at least, than Trump won. But the other thing that happened, I mean, why I think it's so interesting, and I don't think the left is going to benefit this in America. I don't know who does though. This is where, like, I really don't have a feel. For the first time in my life, I don't know where the wind is blowing because it seems to be blowing in 85 different directions at once. And like clearly, yes, right now, like Trump it's all blowing in 85 directions around this one man. But this man is 78 years old. Like, even the stoking the fears that he's going to make himself dictator, I'm like, what, for 6 years? Well, not
Yeah.
that people can't do a lot of damage in 6 years, but I'm just saying, like,
Yeah, who's gonna replace him? Because, like,
right.
if Vance replaces him, I could see, like, the Republicans becoming a natural governing party. I
Well, I
think the
mean,
left underestimated Vance so much, and the fact that they couldn't see his appeal shows their blindness.
this is an interesting thing about Vance. So I'm gonna talk about something I've talked a little bit about. Vance is an interesting character to me. We can talk about the Till money, that's real, but also probably not as influential as people think. He is spineless and on the winds, but he's a great retail politician.
Oh, yeah.
And he does actually understand, even though he has contempt for a lot of the working class in America. And the reason why I actually kind of didn't hate his stupid fucking hillbilly elegy book is that if I think about the mindset I was in when I was a conservative, it was pretty close to his. Because I was often like, oh, I really care about working class people, and I was probably more sympathetic to working class people than he was in that book. But I was like, but we have all kinds of terrible habits, and like there's poverty destroys things and makes people dumb and and I would be like, I would tell people when I was a conservative, I'm a conservative because I love the working class, but I hate poverty. And I don't have any illusions about what poverty would bring. And I don't like poverty porn, which I associated with the left at the time. So when I read A Hillbilly Elegy, I was like, no, I get it. Like, it reminds one, his family life actually reminded me of my own family life. And I'm like my mother, I grew up in Georgia, as you know. My mother actually lived in Ohio for a little while in the aughts. But my mother nurse Jackie'd herself. I guess maybe you don't know that reference anymore. She was a working class woman who became a nurse, but did not have the capacity to deal with that and had chronic pain, and got addicted to painkillers that she would steal when they were remaindered to be destroyed, and got herself stripped of her nursing license. And I
That's
knew story after story of that kind of thing. And I also
that's
saw,
pretty similar to Vance's story. Vince
yeah,
Vance's story.
incredibly similar.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, like when I read Vance's story, I also knew he was not telling all of it because I was like, how did you get into this Ivy League school? Who helped you? You went into the military, but you didn't get an infantry assignment. So what happened? And I discovered like he went into, I think, counterintelligence or something, and he got in with a local Ohio senator, and that gave him a leg up, and then helped him meet the people he needed to meet to get ahead. And so he didn't make up his story, but he did get a break, and he took that break out of the book, right? Pretty normal ex blue collar thing to do, honestly. But when leftists attack that book as like, oh, yeah, I remember reading, I think it was Eileen Jones, a Jacobin, like finger wagging at Vance as like a fake working class person and using we a lot. And I'm like, you have a job at a university. Like at best, you might have the same origins as Vance, but I doubt it. And so, yeah, I mean, I thought Hillbilly Elegy was kind of a reactionary book, but it was one I related to and could see why it had such a mass appeal, but also why liberals might like it, because it's also shamey of the working class. But I do think one of the things I hate from the college educated types, particularly who don't come from a blue collar background, is romanticizing the pathologies of poverty. Like, one of the reasons I'm a socialist is because I think my community's been devastated by things like narcotics and alcohol. And while I wouldn't make a lot of these things illegal myself, I also wouldn't just do what they did in Portland and just like, we're going to legalize them and do nothing else. So it just seems crazy to me. It speaks to things that I don't think people realize it speaks to. I'll give you an example of it. The upper middle class and the working class are equally drug-addled in the United States. We're a pretty drug-addled country. Why are the results so different between the working class and the upper middle class? It's pretty clear. The upper middle class have access to therapies and stuff, and can also more easily hide from policing, particularly true if you're white. And the working class can't. And also, the upper middle class can afford slightly less dangerous drugs.
That's the reason I was never a right winger. So I was like very tuned into all of that. Like I don't know. I always had a fascination with like narcos and stuff, and like the history of drug policy. I was always like a kind of decrim proponent. Not a fan of the way we do safe injection sites, though. Like I find like that to be a total shit show. But we can talk about that's a whole nother thing. But like I always found that the right would always be like, we care about drugs, we care about crime, and I was like, yeah, I do too. But like you're like very clearly it's a class issue, as well. Like, and also, there's supply and demand. Where's the demand coming from? They never deal with that. They only want to deal with the drugs. But like, look, this is the kind of thing I found reoccurring in Mike Davis's book, Prisoners of the American Dream, in his History of the Right. Is that like one thing he mentions even about the kind of Reagan's age, is that like while they didn't promise anything in terms of like economics that would help the poor, they promised something which was tough on crime policy. And believe it or not, though, like I'm not talking to you, but like some leftists, that's very popular with working people, especially if you live in dangerous areas. That is extremely popular. And there's this kind of thing that like I saw it in academia actually, is that there's a kind of pervasive view among leftists that like crime actually isn't that bad, and that it's the media's fault for making it seem like crime is so bad, and that like people are just brainwashed into thinking crime is bad. And it's like, no, crime is bad. You don't think crime is bad because you live in the suburbs. Like,
Right.
crime is bad, but like how do you deal with it, right? And then the right is just like a hammer. But like you have to have an alternative response that is better, like that actually gets at the cause. And But to deny it, like, I have seen leftists say that, to say, "Oh, it's not actually that bad."
No, well, this is a thing. Okay, so one thing they'll do is they'll say, I actually did a whole piece on this on crime that I pointed out that no one's telling you the truth about it right now. Murder was a lot more common before 1980. Now, it's still pretty, like, it's still like way more common in America than any other major OECD country. I think we have now even gotten worse than Russia, which used to be the place that banned guns, that we had a lesser murder rate than. Although, even in the case of Europe, I actually want to point this out to people. What they're often only comparing is gun crime. If you look at like assaults and whatnot, some of Europe actually gets quite bad. It's not lethal. My point is, however, that I don't like the right's answer to crime. Now, one of my funny things that I would say, like, I believe in police abolition if everybody has to be part of the police. And people are like, what? I'm like, yes. Like, if you're going to get rid of the police, you need total social conscription, which, tell that to left. It's just like, what? And I'm like, yeah, that's historically what it meant, by the way. Like, you get rid of the police, and then everybody now has to serve time in the internal peacekeeping units. That's what the
What? I
Bolsheviks
thought it
did.
just means that I can drink my latte and read Marx, and there'll be no problems. We can just have the people who, are drug addicts will just get the injections from the government, and, we give if we give welfare, there'll be no crime.
Yeah. That's, well, this is the thing.
Like, yeah, I mean, to me, it always made sense that if you're for police abolition, you just have a different form of police that isn't state.
Right.
You just protect your own community. But, like, without
Right.
that makes no sense. It's like the Panthers made sense to me because they protected their communities. But if you have abolished the police without any protection of the communities, what I've always heard coming out of black media was the complaint was always that, like, the cops would support white people and not black people. The complaint was that the cops didn't pay attention to crime in the black areas. Not that, like, they want to have no cops. Like, there's that lyric, I came faster than 911 in white neighborhoods. It's like a J. Cole lyric that I think was originally a Tupac lyric.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, I mean, you can't, like, if anything, it's like, yeah, that's why the Adolf Reed has talked about this. There was, like, a lot of actual support initially in the black community in the United States for the crime bill, partially to respond to, like, a lot of the crime that was occurring as a result of a lot of causes. Could say the crack cocaine epidemic being part of it. But, like, if you're gonna, like, if you're not gonna have the cops, well, you need something. You need to protect your communities. That always made sense to me. But the people who are, like, LARPing about, like, ACAB and talking about also, like, getting rid of guns, that's a weird thing. Like a liberal position I hear, like, leftists tail sometimes in America, which is, okay, well, abolish the police, but also we need, like, gun control.
Who's going to enforce it? Also, like, I never understood that either, because I'm like, okay, gun control.
To
Who's
be
gonna be
fair,
able to-
wait, so they say defund the police, but still, you get what I'm saying. Like,
Right.
even that
No.
kind of, like, odd.
Also, I'm just going to say, I think defund the police is even stupider than abolishing it. You're going to take the funding away from the people with the guns and then not think they're going to do things to keep their funding back, which means either cracking down on every small thing or getting into illicit shit traditionally. Because also, if you're not going to employ the military within the US borders to fight the police, good luck taking away their guns. There's a reason why the municipal governments are afraid of them.
Right, that's the phenomenon is a reoccurring phenomenon is that, like, it's the local police who always seem to be way more corrupt than the federal police. This is, like, notorious in Mexico, of course, like, how AMLO has kind of been dealing with that is not by, like, defunding the police, but actually kind of more funding the federal, which I know can be a slippery slope, but, like, the thing is, like, the problem with police isn't just, like, yes, the police are overfunded in the US in terms of, like, they're like stormtroopers, whereas, many cops in countries don't even have guns. But, like, if the problem is, like, that cops are beating people up or attacking people for petty crimes, your solution is to like take away funding. And how you do that, I guess, could depend. It's like if you're reallocating funding to other things, maybe in terms of like the wages of the cops, but like defunding the military armory, I guess it could make sense. But rhetorically, it's also stupid. Like if you just say generally, like defund the cops, because it's like
Yeah,
people think in their head, "Oh, we're just gonna have like shittier cops now." Great.
right. I mean, I didn't understand it, and it was also clear they didn't believe it. And I mean, the one thing you can say that maybe Canada doesn't have, but we definitely have here, is you have milquetoast 80-year-old centrist Dems using super far left rhetoric selectively, with a few people, particularly AOC and whatnot, trying to ride that out of the coattails as a way to get up. And it's hard to know what you're gonna do with that. It became very clear that, like, for example, the expanded squads. So you have your 2018 squad. Most of them are still around. AOC is pretty much untouchable in her district right now. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib represent their districts pretty accurately, but they actually have very different politics. The left saw APAC going after Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. But here's the issue. The reason why APAC went after them is because they were politically weak, even with their own base. Bowman at one point accused the DSA of being CIA agents, said to undermine him, which is insane. And Cori Bush
Blame
pissed
the
off.
election on racism too. On white
Yeah.
people after.
Yeah. And not the fact that, like, in greater New York, he had a rally with AOC and Bernie there, and they couldn't get 300 people there. And there was all of this debate on Twitter about the Palestinian group processing them. And I looked at that damn rally, and I'm like, there's 300 people there and there's 50 counter protesters. Why are we fucking talking about this? If you can't attract, with Bernie Sanders there, enough leftists to not at least break 1,000 in the greater New York area, you have already lost. And that is not APAC money. That is popularity. What APAC money does is ensure that the person replacing him doesn't do the same things. But Bowman and Bush were politically vulnerable. Bush pissed off labor by, during the Build Back Better bill, being completely inflexible on carbon credits without any offsets. She was willing to fold on the offsets, but not the carbon tax.
That's
Which-
I think why let progressives support the carbon tax is a whole other can of worms. Doesn't it
Right.
work? We've had it in Canada. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. All it does is you end up people with SUVs pay higher taxes. And people who are gonna fossil fuel companies are gonna do what they usually do as long as they're allowed to build pipelines, and as long as you use oil, like fucking get at the demand. Getting at the supply before you get at the demand is always stupid. And also trying to remove the cure, even if it's a problematic cure, before you remove the cause, the symptom, is just like a disaster. It's also like the safe injection site thing. It's like, okay, like before you deal with like that problem, you just like you want to reduce deaths, right? So and it does reduce deaths. The studies have suggested it does. But like what ends up happening is you just have like overcrowded cities of homeless people, zombie zones, and then people from like outside of the city end up going there so that they can get the fucking safe injections. So you just get like cities like San Francisco that are total disasters. You have it in Vancouver and Toronto, not like that. Why? Because it's more regulated. And even then we have kind of that issue too. But like they're not out in the open. We don't have safe injection sites out in the fucking open near like kids' schools. Like, I didn't think this was a problem until I went to Vancouver and went near Gastown, which is like kind of part downtown. And it's like, I was like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, this is supposed to be a city that has like less poor people than Toronto. And there's it just looks like zombie land down there. So like, that's a policy failure. It's not just an economic failure.
Yeah. Well, it worries me about where the Democrats are going to go because, for example, if you compare the two major Democratic strongholds, New England and California and slash Cascadia. So that is Seattle, aka Little Vancouver. I'll give the Canadian listeners a little credit for one. And the Bay Area and LA. What you see in California is there never was Ford has kind of bypassed the American West because they weren't really industrialized yet. And so, like, yeah, there's some of that, but this big infrastructure that even the bankruptcy of New York City in the 70s couldn't kill has allowed New York to handle the situation of homelessness far better than California. What does California do? Throw massive amounts of money at NGOs who don't do anything. I mean, they do stuff, but it doesn't work. And there's no accountability because, okay, what are you going to do? Well, the NGO fails. We found a new NGO. We throw that money at it. So they spend more money for less results. You see this with stuff like safe injection sites too, that are out in the open. They need to be secure. You need people there. And here's the other thing. Where the fuck are these people going to come from? I mean, I have this question about Trump's policy too. Trump seems to think that we need to increase labor in the United States while also deporting a bunch of people. Okay, fine. I do think the irony of having liberals and leftists defend basically slave labor is pretty fucked up. It's not quite slave labor, but it's barely not. You know, with our agriculture fields, they're like, oh, well, things are too expensive. I'm like, well, we'd have to, we can fix that, but you don't want to. But I will also say that what you see is, it is grift. Now, what's replacing it is just outright carnival barker hucksterism. But what we're seeing, in my mind, is a sophisticated form of rent seeking versus an unsophisticated form of rent seeking. And what really complicates this is that the tech oligarchs have definitely moved to unsophisticated. When you look at these policies, such as, for example, open injection sites or whatever the fuck they're doing with homelessness, one of the things I was like, okay, you don't want to. What was the defenses of not breaking up the camps, the homeless camps? All right. Now I see what happens to it out here in Salt Lake City. We just push them into different neighborhoods by breaking up the camps, and the shelters suck ass because they're underfunded. All right. But instead of trying to fix the shelter situation, or even going back to in Salt Lake, where I live, we had a progressive mayor. We had a first in the nation homeless policy. We literally gave them abandoned homes. The city would buy them and put them in there. We stopped it. All right. Now we spend most of the money on increasing policing of the homeless, which doesn't work. This idea, we're like, oh, we should protect the homeless encampments. And I'm like, we have to go out there with knock-a-non all the time to keep people from dying. Like voluntarily. And some of our people get assaulted when we do it. Can we at least be honest that this is not a great idea? The Bay Area. It's true. The Bay Area has relatively low crime. LA has relatively low crime, except in the homeless areas where the crime is astronomical. All right. Now it's all concentrated in this tiny little sliver of the city. It's almost like we're human sacrificing these poor people so that we don't have to deal with either that problem or general crime. Now, it is also true that if you want, like in the United States, that the crime is worse in red areas, but that's often because the police are underfunded there too. One of the reasons why when they moved from abolition to underfunding, and I've already told you what I thought police abolition was, and I knew that no one was serious about it like I was serious about it, what I meant by like recruiting all of society to militia forms to do the public service. I didn't see anyone doing that. So I was like, okay, whatever. Is that I saw conservative governments cut police funding in the 1990s up to the crime bill. And what happened? The murder rate skyrocketed. My hometown of Macon, Georgia, not a big city, had one of the highest murder rates in the United States per capita in the late 90s. It took 10 years to get it under control.
Be alarming because like the so you're saying like Republicans basically did a kind of like defund the police, but because of austerity
Yep.
for like neoliberal austerity
Mhm.
purposes, and that had that effect. And it's like you have the progressive wing today, which is like defund the police, but for humanity.
And like, look, I don't trust the cops either. And I do
Yeah,
think there's you know, I don't want people to think I have a very sanguine view on this. And my view on prisons is even lower. But then again, people don't ask me what I want to replace that with. I horrified someone when I said that I was okay with corporal punishment. I'm not capital punishment. I wouldn't kill anybody, but I'm like, yeah, just cane them. And people are like, what? I'm like, well, if you commit a violent crime, I don't see why we don't cane you. They were horrified. And I was like, well, what do you want to replace prisons? Prisons are awful. They're terrible. But you like, okay, we just hang everybody? Like, what are you going to do? Like,
well, I feel like the most realistic proposal for me that I've ever heard from progressives, the only one that kind of I was convinced by, is like the Norwegian prison type system, which is like you just make prison more rehabilitatory, like about rehabilitation as opposed to retribution. I think you do need retribution in some cases, like for very serious crimes and repeated crimes. But like, I mean, for the most part, I'm for like the kind of lax Norwegian system, but you still gotta send them there. Like you still also want to make sure people don't commit the crimes in the first place, which is like the bigger factor, right? But
right.
like I also like I think a lot of people don't trust left people who talk about prison abolition and also talk about re-education camps.
Well, I mean, clearly they can't mean both, right? I mean, like, but
Well, it's like it does mean both, of course, for like leftists, but it's like sus because it's like how are you defining who gets sent there? Like, you know, is gonna politically persecute people. There's that element too, the sense censorship, and also people who will like say we're for prison abolition, but they just kind of want like gulags, but like chiller.
well, this is another thing I've never understood. Like, to talk about the contradictions of current left is people, and I see less of this now, admittedly, but in 2000, from like 2012 to 2020, the number of people I saw being okay with like, well, because hate speech, we should censor all kinds of stuff. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm not pro hate speech, and maybe it should be an exacerbating factor in other sentences. I'm okay with that. But like, actually, I kind of like knowing where the assholes are and who they are. And I'm not,
Yeah, I don't know. We should learn from Britain. In Britain, they kind of now target like anti-Semitism as hate speech, and they extend that to mean like anything.
yeah, well, this is the
Anything that's
thing.
pro-Palestine.
I do not like, I have admitted that like, I do not like European speech laws. I am a dumb American in that sense. And I'm just like, because the other thing I can tell you guys is, they don't work. Oh, let's make the far right illegal. Well, you sure seem to have as much far right as we do. Just want to point that out to you. Like, okay, so you made being a Nazi illegal, and I kind of get that. I'm not gonna cry too many tears about that. But
Might make them stronger, actually. I think because if you censor them, it forces them to be more sophisticated. I have this whole
right.
I have a thing called Persecution and the Art of Activism. Like it's a
Mm.
sub chapter in my book, which is like playing off of the Leo Strauss Persecution, the Art of Writing, which is that like I really and it's not like this is not a this is not in any way an endorsement of authoritarian regimes at all, but it's like I'm just kind of describing what I think is a phenomenon, which is that like when you make it very easy for people to do activism and to be radicals, you actually kind of you have a much lower now barrier for entry, so people can just enter and participate without thinking very much strategically, and they don't think very much about optics, and sometimes they become self-contained opposition because they literally just are so impotent and incompetent that they don't nothing needs to be really done to stop them. Whereas when there is that suppression, now those ideas aren't going to go away, but they're going to have to like find ways to shapeshift and become more competent, which they probably would have had to do anyway if they wanted to succeed. Because like anyone who's like like Nazism would never succeed in America by people being like, I'm a Nazi. Like, of course, they have to be like Richard Spencer until he got, videotaped or recorded with his crazy rant. But like up until before then, Richard Spencer would wear these suits. He would say, "Oh no, we just care about the declining whatever birth rate." He would kind of make himself seem not crazy, but like until he was recorded, of course, doing that, saying that
Well, this
crazy
is an interesting thing. Yeah, this is an interesting thing about the far right. Like the far right in the 80s and 90s in some ways. Let me put it to you this way. I pointed out that like one of the reasons why we see Christian nationalism today is because Christian nationalism is actually because the general Christianity of the population is no longer there. And so they don't have the generic social support anymore, and you see them get more and more rabid. And that's actually not a sign of strength, it's a sign of decline, although it could reverse the decline. Like but with these weird like racial group stuff, until about 2014 and Twitter, honestly, they use very sophisticated rhetoric, which they almost always stole from the left. So human biodiversity was a code for race realism. And human biodiversity comes from a left-wing anthropologist trying to argue for keeping like different ethnic groups and languages alive, but got reappropriated to genomics almost within months of it coming out. And I find it interesting that one of the reasons that you could really oppose that, because the alt-right in America died for the most part, not literally, but as a movement during the first half of the first Trump administration. All right.
with Charlottesville.
Yeah, with Charlottesville. It became non-viable. And that was because they quit using the sophisticated rhetoric and hiding who they were.
Mm-hmm. But they fucking killed people.
Right. Whereas the one group in the alt-right that didn't do that, and it's hard to say they're alt-right, it's just because the way liberals use the term, was the neo-reactionaries. The neo-reactionaries had two advantages over the other forms of alt-right. They appealed to the elitism of the tech bros.
Right, yes. Garvin, definitely.
Mhm. And they're not explicitly racialist. In a multiracial society, they might be Western supremacists, they might even be white supremacists in some degree, but they're going to speak a way that allows you to incorporate all kinds of different groups into your system. But the one thing that they had that the other groups had is, frankly, they flatter rich people. And so they didn't go away. But the other groups did. And the other thing we'll say about neo-reaction maintained its esoteric way of speaking. And so you had Curtis Yarvin, and in some ways I blame, there's many things that I'm very quiet about, but I think one of the ironies is like Curtis Yarvin got a lot of press early on when he was Mencius Moldbug because Mark Fisher was writing about him. And why was Mark Fisher writing about him? Because Mark Fisher was having this response to his own break with the CRU and with Nick Land going crazy and trying to distance himself from him, but actually in doing so spread Moldbug to all kinds of places that he wouldn't have been able to get otherwise.
It's how I even found out about Nick Land, through Mark Fisher.
Right. This is why I'm always very careful of, like, when I tell people, like, for example, the people who are constantly railing on the ACP. I don't like the ACP, but like the people who are constantly railing on the ACP, I'm like, every day you do that is another day that they don't tear themselves apart. If you stopped those groups, because there's actually pretty profound differences in different members of the ACP, we'll tear each other up. We've already actually started to see it, because the other thing that happens if you're
to get into that juice, the ACP juice, we could save that for a little time we have left for the backroom segment if you want.
Sure, we can do that. We can talk about the ACP and some of these other groups. But I kept I guess my point though is, like, by attacking these anti-systemic groups, you keep them in the media eye and actually help spread their message, particularly the way social media algorithms work. So people always complain about me vague posting, but I'm like, if I post directly, I'm actually spreading the message of the people I'm criticizing. And you know who I'm criticizing, but other people don't. And so, yes, it makes me at all. It doesn't help me grow my algorithm. Sure, I don't really care about that. But like, if you attack the ideas and not the groups, you're not helping the groups grow. But the other interesting thing about this anti-systemic stuff, and this is why the people, to go back to something you said before we go behind the paywall, that I really want people to think about is that if the left grew in response to Trump, which, by the way, the American millennial left really did go gangbusters in response to Trump. The DSA went from like 5,000 members to 20,000 members because of Jacobin to like almost 100,000 because of the response to Trump and then the pandemic. However, within 2 years of the Biden administration, because so much of the DSA was seen to be an extension of the Democratic Party, what happened? They lost about half their membership. They rest somewhere between 50 and 60,000. They're experiencing a small bump now, but the other issue is, where's the bump going to go? Is it going to go into the part of the DSA that wants to break off and form its own party, or is it go to the part of the DSA that's going to be Democratic Party staffers? And the thing with the Democratic Party staffers is they can just join the Democratic Party when the Democratic Party is in charge, and they do. And then, but you look to be holding the bag for the Biden administration, and so you lose all counter systemic force.
Yeah,
That's the other thing
that's
that
why they got big, is because they're new. Like,
Right.
yes, they got big because it's new, and they didn't get tested with power. But like, when you're seen as an extension of the Democrats, I mean, this is the kind of problem with like like, I don't like to. I'll be frank, man. I don't really like the word leftist. Now, I don't
Mhm.
want to sound like, oh, it's post left shit. But the reason why I really don't like the word being a leftist, like, oh, I never identify. I would say I'm on the left dispositionally because the dominant economic order, the dominant way of thinking socioeconomically, is right wing relative to where I am, which makes me left, right? But like, I don't identify as a leftist because
Mhm.
like, what is the politics you want? I identify usually as a socialist Republican of sorts. That just means like a kind of democratic socialist, a Marxist of a kind, but like in a very non-sectarian, very revisionist kind, I guess you could say. But like, what matters to me is like, what do you want to see? Like, what are the ideas that like you give a shit about? Like, how do you want to organize society? The problem with being leftism is that it's defined. The only thing that unifies the left at all is being anti-right wing. So if you make your identity as being a leftist, your politics end up being, I just hate right wingers. And what is the consequence of that kind of politics? You become a democratic, like, you become like basically a rogue wild dog of the Democratic Party. That's what happens. Like, they become like attack dogs against the Republicans that the Democrats benefit from. Because yeah, like, if your politics are defined by what you hate, which is like, I'm left, so I oppose what is right of me. Well, of course you're going to hate the Republicans more. So your politics are going to be hating like Republicans and hating right wingers. And when it comes down to it, as much as you'll critique the Democrats for being right wing, you'll vote for them anyway because your politics are defined by hating right wingers. And as much as you claim to like threaten to break from the Democrats, deep down, the wish is just to have the Democrats be a little better, right? Like, this seems to be the politics of like a lot of like leftists in America. It's like, okay, I just hope the Democrats would pick like Bernie, and then that would be solved, right? And I don't know. It's like forgetting Bernie wasn't a
Yeah, I
Democrat
mean,
most of his life for a reason. Wasn't a Democrat for a reason.
right. I'm with you on this. I mean, I think one, I even talked about, I said this is a warning actually to people, and they didn't, it wasn't really taken very seriously, because I was like, look, in the first and second Obama administration, the libertarians were his primary opposition. They were seen as counter systemic to Obama. They got tied into the Tea Party, which was also counter-systemic to both Obama and to parts of the GOP. The Tea Party got dissolved too. We can talk about Trump as a manifestation of the Tea Party, but actually Trump's politics is not the Tea Party's politics. They may have been the basis of which he can launch himself, but they were liquidated in that launch. The alt-right, which came later, clearly liquidated themselves when they decided, instead of being, solitary but sophisticated racist weirdos, to be racist weirdos coming out more and more for Trump, which, if you ask Richard Spencer about his regrets, that's one of them. I mean, he's basically a racist Bidenist today. That's where he's at.
Weird. Why didn't he become a Democrat? Was it because he just likes Ukraine so much because they're white people that he sided with the Democrats because they're more pro-Ukraine? I'm confused.
I think actually he wants a social welfare state. He just wants it for white people. And he was like, well, the Democrats will probably do that anyway.
Oh, so he's like a Democrat.
Yeah. I mean,
and
he felt burnt. I think he also felt burnt by Trump's flailing between coalitions. But also what he's not looking at is when you say you're anti-systemic, but you're tailing somebody, when they win, you're stuck with their baggage, whether you like it or not.
Right. It's like MAGACOM people. They're collapsing partially because of what's happening. I don't know if they're really how much they're really collapsing or whatever, but definitely I've noticed with Trump's Gaza stuff, immediately they just lost so much credibility because they kind of also did the whole Trump's the peace candidate thing. Right. So
right.
And now some of them more than others, because there seem to be, like you said, ideological differences within the MAGACOM base, within the MAGACOM leaders, quote unquote. But some of them who I think were more believed in the Marxism, the communism part of the MAGA communism, are now very anti-Trump.
Right.
And they're kind of confused why Trump did this. It's I don't know. I don't blame them though for thinking Trump's a peace candidate. If it wasn't for Trump's Israel ties, I would have thought that too. But it was Trump's Israel ties where I never really believed that, because I mean, look at what he did last time with Jared Kushner. Just look what Jared Kushner. Listen to Jared Kushner be interviewed on Lex Friedman, and let's hear what he has to say about his plans in Gaza. He's going to put his family's interests first. And
that's the one thing we can say for sure. Although Ivanka's not in the government, but the one thing I can say about Trump is Trump has never gone after his own family. Every other coalition member, however, no matter how loyal you've been in the past, you are potentially a target. Although we'll see how long that lasts with Elon, because I'm surprised that Trump is happy with people, even on the right, talking about Elon being the real president. So it's going to be interesting.
He's there because he has a lot of money.
Yeah,
I think, because it's insane to there must have been people who were mad about that Nazi salute, because that was the stupidest shit I've ever seen.
No, there's got to be a lot of. It's also showboating. If you got to think about it from Trump's perspective, Trump played very nice. He gave a. I mean, for Trump, he gave a United America speech, and then Elon did that shit. So Trump, if you compare Trump's 2016 speech to his 2024 speech, I mean, his 2016 speech was far scarier. Now, at first 2 weeks has actually been far scarier under this Trump. But he was trying to play nice. And you have Elon doing that shit, distracting from him. I don't know, man. I mean, it's hard for me to say. And I'm also but I really wish people would quit trying to figure out how we can game Trump for the left when we have no idea what he's actually doing. And I'll say on this, I don't think anybody really knows what he's doing. His coalition partners seem often as surprised as anyone else.
Netanyahu seemed surprised at that meeting, the one where he's trying to keep the evil smile the whole time. But he kind of looked like he looked like he didn't even know what Trump was going to say next.
Quite possibly he doesn't. I mean, but everybody I've known, including myself, frankly, who tried to play the "we're going to predict what Trump does" game, ends up with egg on their face. So, maybe we should back up and try to respond based on something other than just being constantly stuck in this stupid cycle. Because I also think my fear is if the left did go back into resistance mode, the way it did in 2016 to 2020, which I don't think it can do, but what it did is it bought the center of the Democratic Party time.
Mhm.
And what did the center of the Democratic Party do at that time? It normalized a bunch of Trump policies to the point that Trump could then oppose himself. And there were some few economic progressive things, but some of it was by accident. Like when I tried to get people to understand that Joe Biden's old and he's a Mondale Democrat more than a Clinton Democrat, but that doesn't mean he's a progressive. It means he believes in like throwing meat to all parts of the coalition. So
Mhm.
he gave Lena Khan a chance and labor leadership a little bit of a chance while also undermining them in other areas. Right. But Harris wouldn't have done that. That was going to go away with Harris too. So it's just, it was crazy to me what people thought that they could do. And the idea that we were going to push him to the left always seemed nuts to me, because I was like, he's clearly just, I mean, The Economist, I think what The Economist called Biden was Trump with a human face, or Trumpism with a human face. And that's kind of true, which ironically means that Trump could pivot far more to the right or radically against his own prior policies and not take any responsibility for that, because he looks to be opposing the Democrats who just rationalized his policies.
I mean, you could say they did push him left, though, just not on any of the things that matter.
But true.
Like,
I mean,
that's a kind of funny thing. Like, you get the worst of both worlds, because what ends up happening is like a lot of the general public thinks that like the country's gone far left, and then they associate the failures of like that government as being left, because like you did see in the polls, people were saying they thought Kamala was too left. And then what did they think she was too left on? Was it like, did they think that she was gonna like give them too much like healthcare, or did they're gonna give them like employment? No, they kind of thought in their head, like they saw the Trump attack ads about like, you just about transgender toilets or whatever culture war thing. And the fact is like Kamala Harris doesn't actually believe in any of that, but she played into that stuff up until the weeks before the election. The primaries are the worst. I think primaries are
Mhm.
where you get the worst of the pseudo progressivism, because in the primaries they all want to compete for like the progressive voter base. So the people who are actually very right wing economically, they will go even harder on the progressive stuff as a way to like outflank the likes of Sanders or whoever is like more economically left. So you'll have like, I remember like it was crazy at seeing like the Democratic primaries in 2020. There were like unironic like open border type like stuff. They wouldn't put it that way, but I remember they asked the question, would you give free healthcare to illegal immigrants? And it's like a lot of them said yes, including Kamala Harris, and that's like a total like recipe to get attacked. And it's like saying you are going to give free healthcare to illegal immigrants in a country that doesn't even have free healthcare for its own population is not going to go very well at all. Like it's just like a resentment politics that like is a gift to the right. It's like incredible. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I think about this a lot. When I lived in Egypt during the counter revolution, you know what I didn't do? Talk a lot about Egypt. Not because I didn't believe in Egyptian politics or anything like that, but because I didn't want the heat, and what I was doing, which was like monitoring what was happening to like labor leaders and stuff in my community who were being disappeared, was better that no one knew I was doing it. And this applies to so many different things. Like, look, I think politicians should be fairly transparent about what they believe, but why take a bait question? Or another culture war one. I remember thinking of this all the time. The amount of culture war stuff that was dropped about birthing persons or whatever the fuck that came up in that one debate in 2021. I was like, why can't you just say people? Just say people. You have a normal word that you don't even have to throw anyone under the gender bus for, that won't call attention to itself. And you're using like this medical patrol word, which is weird, admittedly, and that's not even used commonly amongst activists. And you're dying on this weird hill. Another one of these examples is like people who were like, Latinx used by Latin people. I'm like, oh yes, there's some university educated people in Argentina who said Latin. Sure, absolutely, real thing. But that is not why it started being used in educated circles. And I was amazed at how fast that got adopted. That was a real difference from the past. Like in the past, on these left culture issues, university students would use this language. Professors would encourage students to use this language, but they wouldn't use it with the general public. You wouldn't have media figures getting out of schools talking about Latinx.
Yeah,
Now, again, you could just, if you, in English, you know how you degender that word? Just say Latin. You don't even, like, you could just say Latin. You don't even have to gender the word. I'm just like, why are you doing this? But we know why they're doing it, because it is a cultural capital signifier to certain people. It's an in-group signifier. But it's weird to watch politicians like Joe Biden try to signal to this in-group that they clearly don't belong to.
because that's their staffers. Their staffers tell them to do that. That's what I think.
Right.
And their
Yeah.
staffers are all PMC. And like, it's not just a problem with the Democrats. I know this about the new Democrat Party in Canada, the NDP. All their staffers are like upper middle class people from universities. So they tell them
Yeah.
stuff like, oh, you got to say, if you're going to say, you want to be inclusionary. So if you talk about homeless people, make sure that you talk about particularly transgender people of a very specific age group and a very specific race. Like, it's just a very, very, you can tell, like, when you get out of touch politics, it's because the people who make them are out of touch. I don't think it's that complicated.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And it's super duper duper frustrating, particularly when, sometimes I feel like I'm just going crazy because I'm like, I figured out how to not gender these things and not alienate normal people and not call attention to myself. There are things that, like, I got yelled at for not saying houseless or whatever, or unhoused, excuse me, not even houseless. Because,
What?
homeless, this is a big thing in the United States right now amongst progressive activists. Now, I can tell you, I have been homeless. It does not undignify me to say I was homeless. When you say I was unhoused, you are making yourself feel better because I have a home, thus we don't have to change anything. That is the implicit statement in that there are so many weird implicit statements in some of these progressive euphemisms that are in the United States that actually justify the bad conditions of our current situation by pretending to valorize the people at the bottom, but also in a way that removes upper middle class people's responsibility for the situation at hand. For example, if you are just unhoused, well, you have a home. It's not really that bad.
While we still have the time in the back room, I did want to get into the stuff about the people who had interesting predictions about Donald Trump that didn't pan out when it comes to Gaza and other things. But also something you mentioned much earlier. I wanted to actually talk about that, but it was, I think it might be too controversial for the public segment, which is when you said the left's puritanical, it has a mixture of like sexual libertinism and puritanical views, which
Yeah, we
I
can
think,
talk about that behind the paywall. I'm not willing to talk about it. Not paywall, but yes, I'll talk about it.
well, that is like that is something that is so interesting to me, and something that is like, why is that happening? I have a certain theory. I call it sexual neoliberalism. Not like a theory of really like, sitting down and write, but just like kind of thoughts. But like, yeah, we'll talk about that. This has been a very long, interesting conversation as usual with you. If you're not subscribed to Varn Vlog, you're living under a rock. You should do that. Could learn something from. So yeah, appreciate you being here. And if you're not part of the back room already, you already know you're missing out. People who listen will tell you in the comments that you're missing out. So go spend that $5 for a month of getting over 55 exclusive podcasts instead of spending on overpriced coffee in urban cities.
But they say, yeah, so you get 55 podcasts for the cost of one Starbucks. I mean, whatever. Tim Hortons, for those of you in
No,
Canada.
we got Starbucks, but we got to boycott. We got to boycott that shit. So, One Dime Radio patron.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.